Hello, hello, hello. What's up, guys? How you doing? What's up, Vino? How you doing, man? Good to see you. Good to see you. Yeah, it's about to go down. You already know. Ah, hello. What's up, Melly? What's up, Lighthouse? Abby, hello, hello. Doing good? Yeah, absolutely good. Good to hear. Oh man, you look determined. Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it. I was just reviewing things, so that's what that look was for. I always try to get things straight in my head. You're on early. I literally just got home from church. Welcome home from church on a Friday night. Good for you. Hello, Sandy. Hello, hello. First. Oh man, good to see you guys. ACT college. You're going to college. What college are you going to, Abby? What college are you trying to go to? Um, Happy Friday. What's up, JTG? Hello, hello. Savannah. Hello. Good to see you guys. Just finished studying Book of Revelation for the second time. Understand it a lot better. Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, it takes so much to make some of that stuff stick. Were you going through it with the ones that we did here on TikTok, or were you going through it with somebody else, or just on your own? How were you going through it? I wish I understand that book. Um, JTG, we did it. It's up on YouTube. So I feel like we did a decent job trying to explain everything. So if you are interested and if you have time, hello Christina, thank you so much. So if you're interested, all of that is up on YouTube. There's that link up here if you wanted to go check it out. Um, it's a really great book, and we'll probably have to tackle it again. You know, um, not not too much will have changed from the first time that we went through it, but understanding will probably be a lot easier. Christina, hey, thank you so much. Hello, Michelle. Thank you for the gifts. I appreciate that, guys. Thank you. Still, some is confusing. Absolutely, it is. It takes work. That is for sure. Awesome. You will. Cool. I've been watching them on YouTube. That's so cool, Cheryl. Super cool. Blue Letter Bible too. Heck yeah. Hello, Holly. How you doing? So we will probably do a condensed version of the recap tonight because to um, we're getting pretty deep into the book of Matthew, and there's what would be there's what 20 chapters? How many chapters? 28 chapters. Yes, 28 chapters. So we are after tonight. We will be halfway through. So just as we normally do, um, you know how we did the book of Isaiah. We did a pretty in-depth review on the entire book, and so once we got up to chapter 39, we did a long review of all 39 chapters, and then we basically stopped those reviews from chapters 1 through 39. So since we're getting up into half of the book tonight, after tonight, we will probably be done with the full review, the full recap. Hopefully that's okay with you guys, but I just feel like it'll kind of help condense some things. So, because the recaps can go quite a while, and I don't know. I know it kind of helps, but it's Yes. Okay. Cool. It's a lot. Hello. What's up, DLP? How you doing, man? Hello. Hello. Um, can't understand it. Julie. Yeah. It's a tough book, man. It is a tough book. It takes a lot of work trying to understand a lot of things. What's up, Ed King? How you doing, man? But yeah, so I was thinking that we would do that tonight, and so then after tonight, next time we go live, we'll probably just do like a surface, like a real quick flyby. Or I was thinking maybe just changing it to where we just talk on the last 5 chapters or something like that. But who knows? Um, Maybe you could post a recap on your page. Yeah, those are that's a good idea. It just takes so much. Like, I think you can only do 10-minute videos on TikTok, and so like I used to do the recaps, and then I stopped doing them because I can't. I feel like I'm not even able to talk on anything in 10 minutes. Like, how do you even do a recap in 10 minutes? That's impossible. So there's so much. I don't even know if it helps, but that is definitely a good thought. Good, man. Good to see you. Good to see you too. All right, so let's go ahead and get started because this is going to be a whole new. We're gonna do this recap, and it's going to be the longest one, maybe not the longest one, but it's going to be a pretty in-depth review. Just because after tonight, we will probably stop doing these crazy detailed. Um, Recaps since we're halfway through the book of Matthew. Hello, hey, thank you, Sharia. Thank you so much. Thank you, Crystal. Thank you guys for those gifts. Hello, Mimi. How you doing? All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So the book of Matthew. If you guys are new here, thank you so much for being here. My name is Ryan. I am just a student of the Bible. I'm not anything, like I don't have a title. I'm just a guy on TikTok. That's how you need to view me, and you need to always remember that because I am a sinner that was saved by grace just like everybody else, and I am very, very thankful for that. But I just want you to understand who I am if you're new. I don't know everything, and I mess up, and there's questions that I don't know the answers to. There's things that maybe I don't expound on as best as I possibly can. But I do the best that I can, and so with that in mind, I want you to always remember to test all things. I'm sure I've been wrong many, many times. Somebody actually pointed out that I was wrong once. They messaged me directly, and they're like, "Hey, just so you know, you were wrong here." And and I just thought to myself, I was like, oh, I was only wrong one time tonight. So like, but it was good. Like I actually was wrong in that situation, and it was a very, very small detail. I think I mentioned the wrong person's name. And so I was corrected, and so that's completely fine. That just shows that person was paying attention. So I was grateful for it. But it's just one of those things to test everything. Everything I say is not gospel. Don't take it as that. You need to test it all and search the scriptures daily to find out whether these things are true. As Paul tells is, Paul commended the Bereans, and so I want you to remember that he commended them because they received the word with all readiness, and then they searched the scriptures daily to find out whether these things were so. So that's the challenge, and just remember that as we dive into this study. But if you guys are new here, all of these studies are up on YouTube. There's a YouTube link up there if you are interested. But let's go ahead and dive on in. Book of Matthew is an amazing book. It really is. I mean, there's so much history that it really forces you to understand because of where it's at the beginning. Thank you, Melly. I appreciate that. Because the book of Matthew kicks off the New Testament. And so when you understand that Malachi ends the Old Testament, Matthew begins the New Testament, you're like, well, what happened in between Malachi and Matthew? So you start trying to figure that whole situation out, and then you learn that there's about 400 to 450 years that people refer to as silent years. And so since those 400 to 450 years are silent years, the question is, well, what happened during those 450 years? And so that is why, if you're interested in an in-depth description on that, you can go watch Matthew chapter 1, because we spent a lot of time on just the history of it before we even started Matthew chapter 1. But there is so much information, and they're not really silent. They're documented in the book of Daniel, but we just don't have that much detail. But you can go find the history accounts and elsewhere outside of the Bible if you're really interested in it. Josephus mentions a lot, and so it really shines a light on what happened. But um, basically, the cliff notes on the background is to really understand that in Daniel chapter 2, there's four empires that, from God's perspective, there's four empires of the world from God's point of view. It's really important to understand how God sees things. You know, when you remember when Jesus went up to that girl and he said, "Little girl, arise," and he told that little girl to arise. He said that she was just sleeping. And from God's point of view, from Jesus's point of view, that little girl was just sleeping. And so you and I, if you know everybody else that was around there during that time was wailing and crying and mourning and all these things, because they thought she was dead. Jesus sees it differently. And so that's like the different thing. Like, we need to understand that from God's point of view, he sees it, and then we see it from our point of view. So from when he said to that little girl who he said was just sleeping, that is how he sees it. He sees that little girl as just sleeping. And I think that is so awesome to understand how he views things, not how I view things, not how you view things. Forget that. It's how he views things. And so when we understand that, it helps us learn how to think. And so anyways, going back, hello, what's up, Katie? How you doing? When you go back to Daniel chapter 2, in Daniel chapter 2, there's four empires from God's point of view. There's the Babylonian Empire, there's the Medo-Persian Empire, there's the Greek Empire, and there's the Roman Empire. And so all of those empires are basically pave all the way to where we are here in the book of Matthew. And we've done a pretty good review on that. But understanding that in between the Medo-Persian Empire to the Roman Empire, there was a lot of history. There's so much history, so many things that took place during those transitions of empires, and diving into that history really helps you understand other parts in the Bible. And so when we dive into bypassing all of that, just getting right into Matthew chapter 1, and I told you guys, if you guys are new here, we're just going to do this last recap. And then after this recap tonight, from here on, since this is the halfway point, we're going to just probably do a recap of like a real quick flyby of we're not going to do this in depth, since we're halfway through Matthew now tonight. So, but diving into Matthew chapter 1, you get into this genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. You have Matthew chapter 1 through verse 1 through 17. You learn about this genealogy from Joseph's side, and Joseph, the worldly father of Jesus, is what we learn about in Matthew chapter 1. And so what's interesting about this entire genealogy is that if there's 5 women who are mentioned here, you have Tamar, you have Rahab, you have Ruth, Bathsheba, and you have Mary. So those 5 women are mentioned in Joseph's genealogy. What's interesting about that is that women are not normally mentioned in genealogies. And so for there to be 5 of them in Joseph's genealogy really is important to pay attention to. But if you look at this genealogy as a whole, it's technically a genealogy of grace. You just see grace being poured onto it. No matter where you look, everybody's story, where they're coming from, it's just grace is being poured out onto them. And I love that. But there's this one curious person that we learn about here in Matthew chapter 1, which is Jeconiah. And in Jeconiah, he was a very, very bad king. And in Jeremiah 22, verse 30, what you see is that God pronounces a blood curse on Jeconiah. And so when you understand what the implications are of that actually happening, you are like, whoa, what? Because it should make you think, wait, Jeconiah was a son of David. And so if there's a blood curse on the son of David, then how would Jesus be born a son of David, and how could he bypass that curse that he put on his own royal line? And so that's why the genealogies are very important, because in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3, you have 2 genealogies. One is from Joseph, one is from Mary. And so you learn the solution when you read Luke chapter 3, because in Luke's genealogy, which is all about Mary, you see the son of David differs in the genealogies. In Joseph's genealogy, it goes from David to Solomon. In Mary's genealogy, it goes from David to Nathan. And so David went from, because David had multiple sons, and so Jesus was born of Mary and her genealogy, which it's just really cool to see how he bypassed the entire thing. What's up, Pineapple? How you doing? And so when you go into Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, I absolutely love this verse. In Matthew chapter 1, verse 21, it says, "And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." And man, it's just one of those things that's what he was literally sent to do. That was his mission. He will save his people from their sins. And man, I just, it's a verse that we've read every single time so far, but it doesn't get old. Like that was his mission. He literally dove into this mud puddle that we're living in down here, and he came in after us. It is unbelievable, because we're all sinners, and we needed saving. And so he was that rope. He threw us a rope. It's just on you if you want to take the rope or not. And so he did it knowing that some people would reject him. And I'm just like, my goodness, man. Like I think we tend to forget that. I think we sometimes think that we're better than other people because of how much information we know or how much knowledge we know. But we forget from God's point of view that he loved the person who was literally nailing his hands to the cross and his feet to the cross. He loved that man just as much as he loved you. And I'm just like, I let that sink in just for a second. Like, that is unbelievable. It is unbelievable. When you go into Matthew chapter 2, moving on, in Matthew chapter 2, we learn about the Magi, these wise men. And so when you start studying the Magi, you really need to understand the background of the entire thing. So it goes all the way back to, you need to understand the dynamics between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire. The Roman Empire was the superpower of the world back then, but there were other empires in the world, but the Roman Empire was the superpower. So you have this Parthian Empire and this Roman Empire, and they started fighting one another. They just went to battle all the time. And so there is tension, which means that there's tension between these two empires. And so that's important to understand, because when you learn where the Magi came from, you learn that they came from the Parthian Empire. And so they come from the Parthian Empire, and they go all the way into the Roman territory, and they go straight to King Herod, who was appointed king. And they say, "Where is he who was born King of the Jews?" And so it's really fascinating seeing that, because there's all kinds of tension. There's a dynamic. There's the King Herod, he had tension between the Magi who just showed up. King Herod had tension between the Jewish people who he was ruling over, who he was appointed to rule over. Really fascinating stuff. But these Magi show up, and they ask King Herod, who was appointed king of the Jews, they say, "Hey, where is he who was born king of the Jews?" So right when they show, what is that? What was that? That was that. Oh man, thank you. That's hilarious. Oh man, I was not expecting that. I was like, thumbs on my phone. Thank you for that, John. Oh, I needed that. That's great. That's perfect. That's hilarious. Going back to the Magi, hey, thanks, Mark. Yep, that's my YouTube right there. When you go back to the Magi, you learn that they were here, and right when they showed up, they went to the king, and they basically took their glove off and slapped him across the face, because they said to the king, who was the sitting king, they said, "Where is he who was born king of the Jews? Where's the guy who's going to replace you?" Essentially is how that came across to him. So that was a huge threat to Herod. And so anyways, diving into the whole study of just these Magi, it takes you all the way back to Daniel 4 and Daniel chapter 5, because then you learn that Daniel was appointed chief of the Magi, which is, you can find that in Daniel 2, Daniel 4 and 5. And when you understand that the Magi was a hereditary priesthood, meaning that nobody could become a Magi unless they were literally born into that system, then it makes Daniel such just like a big, like, what's going on here? Like, it's just a huge red flag. But the king of Babylon put him in charge of the Magi. And so it's really interesting to see with the effects that decision, we were told that you got to ask questions like, why did the Holy Spirit feel like we needed to know that Daniel was placed in charge of the Magi? Like, why were we given that detail? Like, ask those questions when you were reading. Like, why are we told this? Why are we told that they're in the wilderness? Why are we told what they're wearing? Why are we talking about their shoes? Why were we talking about how many there were? pay attention, ask those questions. And when you ask those questions, when you learn how to ask those questions, then you're going to start just like chasing, pulling on threads and pulling on threads. And you're like, next thing you know, you're learning about stuff that you didn't even try to learn about. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be pulling on those threads and just trying to unravel it all. And it's quite a journey. But what you learn about these magi is that they came all the way from the Parthian Empire. They showed up to Bethlehem looking for the King of the Jews. And you have to ask the question, how in the world did they know to show up? That's like over 1,000 miles of traveling, and they show up and they have an armed guard. It's not 3 wise men like how the song goes. It wasn't just 3. No, there was a whole bunch of them, and they had an armed escort, which is why it talks about how all of Judea, all of Jerusalem in verse 3 were troubled. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 3, it says they were all troubled. But you see, hey, thank you, Maruska. Thank you so much. When you go to Matthew chapter 2, verse 11, you see that there's gold, frankincense, and myrrh that they were presenting to Jesus when they fell down, when they saw him. And these 3 gifts really say a lot about Jesus, or about their understanding on who Jesus was. They understood that he was the gold speaks to his kingship and to his deity, and then the frankincense represents or speaks to his priestly role, and then you see the myrrh speaks to his death. So with those 3 gifts, it was basically you and I learning that they understood that Jesus was God. He was king, he was God, he was going to be having a priestly role, and he was going to die. They acknowledged those 3 things with just those 3 gifts that they gave him. I'm blown away by it. Moving on to Matthew chapter 3. In Matthew chapter 3, we talk about John the Baptist. John the Baptist is out in the wilderness. He's baptizing people. We talked about how baptizing does not save you. You are saved by grace through faith. For by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. That is what we need to understand. It is not baptism. Getting wet, going underwater, coming up does not save you. Does that mean I get saved every time I take a shower? No, it's not that. It is your faith. Your faith. For by grace are you saved through faith. That is very important to understand. Anyways, these Pharisees and Sadducees enter the chat, and they are basically saying, hey, what's going on out here? So when you understand what does it do for you, baptism is just following Christ. You're identifying with him. That's why like when John was out there baptizing people, they were identifying with John's message. And so John was basically the forerunner of Jesus, and so when people got baptized into John, they were identifying with John and his message. And so when we get baptized into Jesus, we are identifying with his message, which the baptism represents the death, burial, and resurrection. And so it's just a public display letting everybody know that you are a follower of Christ, and there's other things that go along with it, but it has nothing to do with earning your salvation or making sure you're saved. It is just something that you do after you are already saved. Anyways, you have these Pharisees and the Sadducees that kind of walk in, and they start challenging John the Baptist, and they're like, what's going on here? But you need to understand that the Pharisees are a key player in this. Every time, you need to understand the Pharisees are just very. The Pharisees are what is being combated in the book of Matthew. Everything that we're talking about is being related back to the Pharisees in some kind of way, because they're in the shadows, and they're like, trying to connive after Jesus. They're doing all kinds of things trying to trap him and all these things, but Jesus shows up and he is basically combating the Pharisaical teachings. And so that is a huge part of this puzzle that we're reading called Matthew. But John the Baptist is confronted by the Pharisees, and he calls them out. He calls them a brood of vipers. That's interesting. A brood of vipers. And so they would understand that takes you back to Genesis chapter 3, because that takes you back to the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So here he's calling them a seed of the serpent, which basically is he's calling them sons of Satan. And so when he's calling them brood of vipers, that's not just like a little, like fun, they're having a fun time calling each other names and tickling each other. No, he is being super confrontational, and he is speaking every one of his thoughts out loud. And he's like, this is how it is. This is how I see it. And it is crazy. He calls them sons of Satan. It's unbelievable. But you need to understand just that, we'll talk more about it, but the Pharisees are more about the legalistic approach. They were very legalistic minded. They were very big on following traditions and laws and rules and all these things. But the Sadducees, they were kind of the opposite. They denied the entire the resurrection. They denied that the scriptures were divinely inspired. They denied those types of things. And so you have the two different religious sects out there, which are the two main ones are the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so here they are, and they're confronting John the Baptist. Anyways, moving on to Matthew chapter 4. In Matthew chapter 4, we learn about how Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Now, I think that's very important to understand that Jesus was quite literally being led by the Holy Spirit for the sole purpose to be tested or to be tempted by the devil. That's crazy. He will let you go through it, but it's just important to understand that he's not the one who is tempting you. That is not what God does. He does not tempt you. That is all Satan. But anyways, when you read Matthew chapter 4, what you find in Matthew chapter 4 is Satan is manipulating the text. He's manipulating it, but he's also using it. He's quoting it. He's wielding a weapon. That is what he's doing here with the word of God. He is wielding a weapon. And so he has this sword, and he's using it improperly against Jesus. And he's like, is it not written? Has this not been said? And he's quoting all of these things, but he's taking it out of context. He's twisting the meaning behind it, and he's challenging him. And so he uses that sword against Jesus, and Jesus rightly defends by rightly dividing and actually using the word how it's meant to be used. And so when you understand that the word of God can be twisted to make you mess up on purpose, or to allow you to think that you can live a certain kind of lifestyle because, there's this person here that says God is love, and so I'm just going to do whatever I want, right? That's not how it's supposed to be. And so that's what the world is teaching now in a lot of places. And it's like, hey, yeah, love covers a multitude of sins, right? Like, hey, let's just go ahead and eat, drink, and be merry. Let's keep on going. The whole point here is that once you are born again is to let your light shine before men so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. You can't be a good ambassador of Christ if you are covered in mud. You got to get that crap off of you. And so that's the whole point. Anyways, Matthew chapter 4, the one thing that I think is important to understand here is in Matthew chapter 4 verse 8 and 9 is that I think basically Satan takes Jesus up on this mountain, and he basically offers Jesus all the kingdoms of the world. And so it's a very interesting thing trying to figure this whole situation out. So there you have Jesus, you have Satan, they're having this whole conversation. Jesus is clearly in the flesh. Satan is clearly whatever. I mean, he's a fallen angel. He's talking to Jesus, but somehow he had the ability to take Jesus somewhere. I have no idea. I am filled with questions in this entire thing, but somehow he was allowed to take and show Jesus all of these things. And I'm just like, this is crazy. Like, what is going on? And so it's almost like Jesus was like, you can't offer me anything. Like, I am God. Do you not know that you are a thing that was created by me, and you are a thing offering me, trying to tempt me with something that I already own? And so it's really interesting, but Jesus allows it to happen. And so anyways, what you see here is that Satan offers Jesus all of the kingdoms of the world. And so when you understand what he was doing here, it's an easy verse to really wrap your mind around, but there's so much more behind it, because what Satan was doing was he was giving Jesus a way around the cross. He was saying to Jesus, don't go to the cross. I understand that you want your kingdom and, the whole thy kingdom come thing. And Satan understood the everlasting covenant that he made with David all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7. He's like, listen, Jesus, I know you want a kingdom. I know you want a kingdom. And you know what? Because I know you want a kingdom, I'm going to be a great guy, and I'm going to give you all these kingdoms. Just bow down to me. And then you can have all these kingdoms. And you know what the best part is that if you do this, you won't have to go to the cross. And thank you, Angela. And so that is Angelia. Thank you so much. And so that is what he ends up doing. He offers Jesus those kingdoms. And you need to understand that Satan had the opportunity he had the power to give those kingdoms away. And you need to let that sink in for a little bit, because when you do, then you'll look around the world right now, and that will allow you to understand why everything is the way it is. Why is everything crumbling down? Why is everything decaying? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Why is this happening? Well, it's because the God of this world, the prince of the power of the air, is the CEO of the world right now. He's telling everybody what to do and basically calling all the shots down here. He's on a leash still. He's not allowed to go beyond what he's, he still has to get permission to do certain things, which is very clear when Jesus goes up to Peter and he says, Simon, Peter, he's like, Simon, Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. And then Jesus is like, but I prayed for you. And so it's so fascinating that you see that Satan is back there and just constantly like, hey, let me get Peter. Let me at him. Just let me do whatever I want to do to Peter, right? And so Jesus is like, no. He's like, and so when you understand that whatever you're going through is allowed, it is Father filtered. When you get hit with something, it is allowed. It is Father filtered. And so this is why it's so important to stay close to the Word of God, because if you're not, then you're going to get pulled in all these other directions. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff tonight with Peter walking on the water. When you get distracted, you start to look at other things, and it takes your mind off what the whole purpose is. The whole purpose is not you being happy. If it was, then explain to me Paul, because when he went through everything, he was literally went through, like, not literally, I just use, but he went through a blender of all kinds of persecutions, right? You see this kind of stuff. It's fascinating. And so when you understand that, do you think Paul was happy in prison? Do you think he was happy when he was getting beat down? Do you think he was getting stoned and they thought they actually killed him? Do you think he was smiling during that entire thing? No. And so we have this American kind of delusion where it's all about us and like, oh, I just really think that we should be happy, right? It's like, no. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And so anyways, diving into Matthew chapter 5. When you dive into Matthew chapter 5, I think, Matthew chapter 5, chapter 6, and chapter 7 are a package deal. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. And so you have this Sermon on the Mount here in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And it's really interesting. But one of the key things to understand here is that who Jesus is talking to. Jesus is talking to his disciples. He's talking to his disciples, but there was a multitude all over the place, and they were all listening, but he's talking to his disciples. He's like, listen, you disciples, this is for you. If you are mine, this is for you. And so that's a big thing to understand. But Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, it says this, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. So what Jesus is saying there is that he's going to fulfill the lowest letter of the law. Every single thing that is going to be, thrown at him, he is going to fulfill completely. It's really, really cool. But the kicker in Matthew chapter 5 is in verse 20. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, Jesus talks to his disciples, and he's talking to his disciples, and he says this. Jesus says, for I, Jesus, say to you, disciples, that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. And so I think that's really important to understand what's going on there, because he's telling his disciples, who are just common people, just regular Joe Blows like you and I, he's telling them, he's like, hey, unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the Pharisees, and from their point of view, the Pharisees were way up here. From the disciples' point of view, the disciples' righteousness was way down here. And so Jesus is telling that their righteousness needs to exceed the Pharisees. And in their disciples' minds, they're like, how is that even a possibility? That doesn't make any sense. And so that's why this is Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7 is basically Jesus shining a massive light on everybody's life, saying that what they're doing is not good enough. Like their interpretation of the law and thinking that they're sons of Abraham is not good enough, because you need to understand the way the Pharisees were teaching everybody. The Pharisees were teaching that if you were a son of Abraham, then you were going to go to heaven just by being a byproduct of a son of Abraham. That was a lie. It is a lie, was a lie back then. It's a lie today. Just because you were born and somebody is in your family tree doesn't mean that you are going to heaven. And that's the way that the Pharisees were teaching people. And so Jesus is basically rewriting everything and trying to right the ship, if you will. He's trying to correct the course. And he's letting them know that their interpretation of the law was completely broken, because they were looking at the physical aspects of everything, like murder and adultery and all these things. And he's like, you think that meant physically? Like if you physically do this and if you physically do this? He's like, no, you need to understand it's all your heart. Your heart. And that is the heart of the matter, is always a matter of the heart, is what he's trying to get you to understand. He's like, but just because you do something doesn't mean that that is when the sin occurred. The sin occurred when you wanted to do something and you started to entertain it. When you start to entertain things and start to run with stuff and be like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this, I'm going to be you could be sitting in the middle of a library, like coming up with all of these thoughts and all of these things and just running with it, and like thinking about this girl or thinking about this guy and running with those thoughts and just doing all these things, or thinking about this hatred towards these other people. And you've already sinned right then and there. That is what he's trying to get them to understand. It's not the physical act that is where they cross the line. It is what builds up to it, which is coming out of the heart, is what he's trying to paint the picture for. But then we get to Matthew chapter 6, and it still is a continuation of the Sermon on the Mount. And in Matthew chapter 6, verse 9, you see how Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. He tells his disciples how to pray, and he says, pray like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When you pray for thy kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, you're praying for the kingdom. You're praying for the messianic kingdom. You're praying for the millennial kingdom. This kingdom, you're praying for his kingdom. And so you're praying for you're praying for the kingdom program. You want it here. Same concept with Psalm 122, where it says, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. You need to understand that there's not going to be peace in Jerusalem that is a lasting peace until the king is here. And so when you pray for the peace of Jerusalem, in a roundabout way, you're praying for the kingdom, because there is not going to be peace in Jerusalem until the king is in his kingdom. And so there's just different dynamics that are associated with that. But moving on to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, we talked about, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 13. Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 says this: Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and narrow, and there are many who go in by it, because narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. So what he's doing here is he's contrasting the Pharisaical teaching of the broad way, because remember, he's talking to the majority of Jewish people at this moment in time here. He's talking to a Jewish people. The way that they were trained up in thinking is that they were all good, right? Because they're all born sons of Abraham, right? So we're good, right? Yeah, you're good, guys. But then Jesus shows up and he's like, no, that's the broad gate. You think that that's going to actually work for you? No. The narrow gate is me. And so when you read John, the Gospel of John, what you'll find is that there are 7 I will statements throughout the Gospel of John, one of them being, I am the door. And so that is what he's alluding to here. He says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. And so that was Jesus's way. That's the narrow way. But the Pharisaical teaching was hey, you're all sons of Abraham. You're all good. Like right when you die, don't worry. Father Abraham's going to catch you when you fall. Before you fall into Hades, he'll grab you and, take you to paradise. You know, that was their teaching. And so he's drawing a stark contrast into their teaching. And I need you to understand that, like, what's really going on there is that Jesus is making enemies right now. He is making enemies to these smart people, these very intelligent people. They're like, oh, I read books. And what do you mean? Like, I know what I'm talking about. Like, I'm a smart person. And there's a lot of people out there who really value my opinion. And then here comes Jesus, and he shows up and he's trying to tell them. And they're not happy with it. And so this is a building, the beginning of this buildup. And so anyways, when you go down to verse 21, Matthew chapter 7, verse 21, Jesus is looking to his disciples again. While all the other people, the Pharisees, the scribes, they're all in the crowd, but he's talking to his disciples and he says, hey, disciples, in verse 21, he says, not everyone who says to me, and he points to himself and he's like, this is about me. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father. And then he says, many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? Have we not cast out demons in your name? Have we not done many miracles, many wonders in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. And that is terrifying. Can you imagine, like, the faces in the crowd when Jesus was saying this to his disciples? It had to have just been, they had to have been flabbergasted. They were like, what are you talking about? Are you saying that sometime in the future I'm going to have to stand before you and you're going to tell me that you never knew me? Who do you think you are, Jesus? Do you think you're, like, who are, like, what? And so you see that this is not something that they wanted to hear. And so he's righting their wrong doctrine. He's trying to tell them what's going on here, but they just didn't, they weren't going to see it. And they were getting more enraged and enraged as time went on. Thank you, TK. Hey, thank you, Giving Grace. Thank you so much. And so it's a very narrow way, but he's basically all throughout here is he's drawing a contrast between what they were teaching and what he was teaching. He's like, this is what you say, this is what I say. Pick a side. And then when you get to Matthew chapter 8, moving on to Matthew chapter 8, what you find is that Jesus is talking to a leper. This leper comes up to Jesus. And like this thing, like this is like I loved learning about this because of how impactful it really is. But in Matthew chapter 8, you have this situation where the leper comes up to Jesus and he says, Lord, if you are willing, you can cleanse me. And you just see, like, when you understand, when you go and read Luke's account, when you read Luke, the Gospel of Luke, Luke records this same situation, but Luke gives you more detail. Dr. Luke, he's a physician, so Dr. Luke tells us that this man was full of leprosy. You don't get that in Matthew's account. You don't get that in Mark's account. You get that in Luke's account because he was a very physician-oriented kind of mind. And so he tells us that this man was full of leprosy, meaning he was on the point of death. And so he shows up, he goes up to Jesus and he says, Lord, if you are willing, you can. And so what's fascinating about this, because this leper was a Jew, we learned about that in Matthew chapter 8, verse 4. But this man was a Jew, and it was normal way of thinking to associate the healing of leprosy to being a messianic miracle. It was only it was known to be, in their culture, it was known to be a messianic healing, a messianic miracle, a healing that only the Messiah could do. And so that's what's so fascinating about this, because then Jesus touched him. He reached out his hand and he touched him. And you see that Jesus can do, like, we've seen miracles where Jesus was 1,000 miles away and he's just like, hey, go, and I'm exaggerating there. But, the centurion who came to him and like all these other people, he's like, go your way, your faith, let it be to your faith. And so, like, he didn't even have to be there in order to heal somebody. But here, you specifically see Jesus reach out his hand and touch him. He did not have to do it, but he did. That touch from Jesus to that man, we don't know what happened to this man after this. We know that he went to the priest and that he did what he was supposed to do after you are healed of leprosy, which was a testimony to the priest. But what do you think that man did? Like, we don't have his story in this Bible. We don't know what that man went and after he went and told the priest everything. Do you think he just went back home and turned football on and started like doing what he was doing before? No. Like, we don't have that information, but it's fun to just like kind of run with that and be like, what did that guy do after he got healed? Like, you better believe he was on fire and he went all over the place telling people about, can I tell you what Jesus did for me? And so leprosy is a very clear picture of sin, just like leaven. It's an idiom of sin. There are two strong idioms of sin in the Bible, and leaven and leprosy are two of those idioms. But anyways, in Matthew chapter 8, you get to this situation here where all of these miracles are being performed by Jesus, and this is Jesus basically authenticating who he is. He's like, I am the Messiah, guys. He's like, I'm the Messiah. And so he's proving it by doing all of these miracles. And so everybody's talking, like the talk of the town. Everybody's running to and fro, like, "Do you hear what happened? There's a guy, like, he did this. Oh, yeah, he did all of these things." So then he heals the centurion's servant. He heals Peter's mother-in-law. And then he goes on this boat. And while he's on this boat, this crazy storm came out of nowhere. Hey, thank you, Jules. This storm came out of nowhere, and I believe that there is something nefarious behind the scenes, because when Jesus gets up, it says that he rebuked the winds and the sea, and there's a great calm. And it's just like, was there something going on there? I think it's very provocative, to say the least, something satanic going on. Jesus was sleeping, being very vulnerable in his sleeping state. No, just because he's sleeping doesn't mean that he's vulnerable. He is just, how is he holding the entire world together while he's sleeping? It's unbelievable. And so Lucifer, he tries to take advantage of every situation that he can. He approached Jesus when he was weak, weak, air quotes there, when he was fasting for 40 days in the wilderness. And that's when he made his move. And he's like, oh, I'm going after Jesus at this point, assuming that Jesus was at his most vulnerable state. He could have come at him again when he was sleeping in the middle of the sea. It makes sense to me. I'm not being dogmatic about it, but I'm just saying that it seems to make sense. When you go on, though, at the end of Matthew chapter 8, verse 28 to the end of the chapter, you see that Jesus cast out these demons. And so it's interesting to dive into that whole situation, because of how you can really get lost in this, demonology. But these demons it seems that they need a body, because Jesus cast them. He cast them out, right? And so what you learn from this whole situation. Hey, thank you, Jeffrey. What you learn from this situation is that the demons acknowledged who Jesus was. They knew who he was. They say, "What do we have to do with you, Jesus, you Son of God?" The Son of God title is a divine title. That is his divine title, Son of God. And so they acknowledged who he was. And so if the demons believe, then what do you think we should do? It's fascinating, because even the demons believe and they tremble. But just because they believe and acknowledge doesn't mean that they know him. And so that's what you need to understand. There's a lot of people out there who's like, "Oh yeah, I believe in God." And they think that is it. That's what it's all about. It's like, okay, well, does God know you? It's Paul tells us that it's like we know God, or rather, and he changes his mind. He says, you know God, or rather, you are known by God. And so the question is, does God know you? But anyways, you have these demons coming up into Jesus, and they say, "What do we have to do with you, Son of God?" Fascinating stuff. But then they acknowledge what is going to happen to them. They say, "Are you going to torment us before the time?" And so they acknowledge what their destiny is going to be. And so they're just like asking the question, like, "Are you going to torment us before the time?" So they're acknowledging that there is a time, meaning that they understand that they're going to lose, which is fascinating, because I don't think anybody told Satan that, because he's still doing his thing. But he's trying to, and that's in his arrogant state. But it's fascinating. Well, anyways, going back to Matthew chapter 8, verse 31. Matthew chapter 8, verse 31. They say, "If you cast this out, permit us to go away into the herd of swine." Now, it's really interesting when you think about this kind of stuff, because when Jesus cast them out of the men, you have them just kind of like the visual. I'm just using my imagination here, like a visual of them just kind of being right here, like kind of like floating, right? Like with a Hollywood-esque kind of vibe situation there. But then they ask permission to go into the animals. And so for some reason, they are at an advantage when they have a body. And so that's fascinating and very, informative, really, because why are they're looking for a body. They are looking for a body. And so, we got on the whole talk of Nephilim, and, we went down that whole trail, but it's an interesting conversation, to say the least. Not one to get lost in, and I don't want you to get lost in that kind of stuff. But focus on Jesus. And there's I see these TikTok videos, and these people are like, oh, like they read the Apocrypha and they get lost in the Book of Enoch, and I'm like, man, I wonder if you study about demons and angels more than you actually like. Do you know more about demons and angels than you know about Jesus? And so that's where my mind always goes. And so I always try to tell people just to stay focused on the Bible, stay focused on the Word of God. This whole book is about Jesus. It's always pointed to Jesus, and that's where I want to live. And that's where I encourage you guys to stay as well. But going back into Matthew chapter 9, you get a lot more miracles that are going on. In Matthew chapter 9, verse 20, or verse 32, in Matthew chapter 9, verse 32, Jesus healed this demonic or this demon possessed man who was mute. He couldn't speak. And so it's really interesting, because when you understand that back then, when Jesus was boots on the ground, when Jesus was on the ground, there were rabbis who could cast out demons. They had a whole book where they were like, okay, here's what you do. You go to step 1, then you go to step 2, and then you go to step 3, and you do all these steps while you're trying to cast out this demon. Then you can cast them out. But the rabbis didn't have an answer for how to cast out a demon out of a demonic man who could not speak. And so that's the big thing here, because in order for a rabbi to cast out a demonic spirit, they needed to identify the name of the man. They needed to identify the name of the demon, And so that is why even Jesus did that. It was a very common rabbinic practice, because Jesus, remember, he's like, what is your name? And he's like, we are legion, for we are many. And so he identified the demon's name, and then he cast him out, right? But what do you do when you can't identify the demon's name? Well, from a rabbi's point of view, they're like, okay, well, good luck. Sorry, we can't help you out. See ya. But Jesus, didn't matter to him. He doesn't play by those rules. And so when Jesus cast out this demon without identifying this demonic spirit, it's really fascinating to be like, well, all the rabbis, he's getting all the attention right now. He's like, what? You did? What? We couldn't even do that. And you did? And you didn't go by our playbook? Are you kidding me? Who are you? And what do you think? Who do you think you are? Matthew chapter 10, moving on to Matthew chapter 10, this is the chapter where Jesus chooses his 12 disciples in verse 1. In Matthew chapter 10, verse 1, it says his 12 disciples. But in the very next verse, Matthew chapter 10, verse 2, it changes from disciples to apostles. And so you need to understand the difference between a disciple and an apostle. A disciple is what you and I are. If you're a born-again believer and you're a follower of Christ, you are a disciple. We are learners. We are students. We are learning of Christ, right? An apostle is different than a disciple. An apostle is one that is sent forth. When an apostle... okay, so these were the 12 apostles. They had the ability, they were representing the king, they had the authority of the king. And so when they went out to their cities, they were able to do everything. They could do all kinds of wonders and miracles and stuff like that, because they were paving the way for Jesus. So all these 12 apostles go out into this Judea, and each one goes to their own cities, and they're kind of like ping-ponging back and forth, going all over the place, telling everybody, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so then that was their message, but in order to back up their message, they were given all of these miracles to back up their message. And so the miracles were evidence of that reality being true. And so you have these 12 apostles going all over the place, and so they were basically representing the king. They were on the king's authority by being on the business for the king. And these miracles were unique to these apostles, you know. So they were able to raise the dead, cast out demons. I mean, we don't see any people raising the dead anymore, do you? Not at least I haven't seen that on TikTok yet. I'm surprised. You know, maybe I can do it. I'm sure I can use AI somehow. No, who am I kidding? I am so terrible with TikToks. It's unbelievable. You guys, it's so bad. Matthew chapter 10, though, as you go throughout, you see that these apostles, they go out all over the world, or not all over the world, but they go out throughout all Judea, and they are preaching the gospel. They're trying to let everybody know that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And so what you see here is in Matthew chapter 8 and 9, Jesus is doing all of these miracles all over the place, right? So the miracles are being done. Jesus is proving who he is. He's like, I am the king. I am the king. I am the Messiah. I'm the Messiah. I'm the one that you read about in the Old Testament. That's me. So in Matthew chapter 10, this is the presentation of the kingdom. He's like, hey, here's the kingdom. All you got to do is accept it. And so some people do, some people don't. But the majority of them obviously refused. The Pharisees were instrumental in that refusal and rejection of Jesus Christ, because the Pharisees were upset with Jesus because he wasn't doing it their way. He's like, Jesus, you need to conform to the Pharisaical way, and you need to become one of us, and then we'll accept you. But since you're not conforming to us and you want us to follow you, that's a big no-no. We're not doing it. And so it's so interesting to see how that works. When you go to Matthew chapter 11, you get this really, thought-provoking kind of idea, because in Matthew chapter 11, what you see is they were talking about Elijah in Matthew chapter 11 verse 14. In Matthew chapter 11 verse 14, it says this: "And if you are willing to receive it, he," referring to John the Baptist, "if you are willing to receive it, he, John the Baptist, is Elijah who is to come." So that's the whole situation. Like hey, if you were going to receive it, he was going to be John the Baptist. And like, man, how do you make that one like really make sense in your mind? Because then it makes you want to like, what if the whole situation to death, right? Like, oh, if they did receive it, well, then what if this would have happened? What if this would have happened? Well, we know that he knows the end from the beginning. And since he knows the end from the beginning, then there's no need to what if this hypothetical situation to death, because it didn't happen. They refused John the Baptist, and they're going to refuse Jesus. They are rejected John the Baptist, and they are going to reject Jesus. So it's foreshadowing of what's coming to be. Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, we talked a lot about the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a big one for a lot of people. Some people are like, you know what? I think that we really need to obey the Sabbath. And that is fine. The two things that to really understand the most, I think, is to understand that there are two extremes when it comes to the Sabbath. There are people who say, we 100% need to obey the Sabbath and follow and honor the Sabbath, whatever. There's that. And then there's the people who are like, I don't even acknowledge the Sabbath, whatever. Those are the two extremes. I think we need to be right in the middle of it, because it is very important. It is like, it's something that you need to pay attention to, because it's going to, it was applicable in the past, it's applicable today, and it's applicable during the millennial kingdom, because we know the Sabbath is going to be, Isaiah chapter 66, the last 3 or 4 verses in Isaiah chapter 66. In Ezekiel, it talks about during the millennial temple that it talks about how the Sabbath is instrumental. Like it's my point here is that Ezekiel and Isaiah 66 both talk about the Sabbath, and those are both happening in the future. And so that's important to understand. And so since it's going to be around in the future, then that means that completely not acknowledging it right now is not something that we should do. And so, but you need to understand the danger. If you want to observe it, you can. Romans 14 talks about, like, basically, to whatever you do for the Lord, right? That's what we need to do. Colossians, Paul tells us in Colossians 2 that he says, let no one judge you by food or drink or Sabbath or new moon. He's basically saying, he's like, you are not under the law anymore. He's like, you're not under the law. Acts 15 talks about this entire process where all the giants of the faith in the early church, You had Paul, you had Barnabas, you had James, you had Peter, you had all those guys there, and they were talking about how do we direct these Gentiles how to think. And so my point here is to not get roped into being a legalistic, you got to obey the Sabbath type of person. That's not the point at all. You are not under law. We are under grace. But it's really cool because in verse 8, Matthew chapter 12, verse 8, it says, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." And you also need to understand that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That's a big thing. But I love Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 7, it says this. And this is Jesus. Like, this is the second time he's mentioned this in the book of Matthew. Jesus quotes Hosea 6:6. Yeah, Hosea 6:6. He quotes Hosea 6:6 two times in the first 12 chapters of Matthew. That's significant. He tells the Pharisees to go find out. He's like, hey, go find out what it means that where Hosea says, I desire mercy and not sacrifice. Go find out what that means. Do you understand that the one who died for you, the God of the universe, his nature is to desire mercy and not sacrifice? He desires mercy. I love that. But that's what it says in Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. It says, but if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. And I think it's really cool to see that. That's super neat. But anyways, in Matthew chapter 12, what you see is the Pharisees are attacking Jesus. They are looking for a reason to basically get rid of him. And so they start looking at all the laws that he is breaking, and they start like accusing him and saying, you're doing this and you're doing this and you're doing this. And then Jesus just basically defends it perfectly, as he would in every situation. But it's really cool to see him in action because of how smart he is. He knows his stuff, and that is our advocate at work. That is our lawyer going to bat for us right there. Like, that's how it is. Like, you see this accusing type scenario in a, like kind of a courtroom situation where the Pharisees are like the prosecutor and Jesus is the defender. And he's defending wonderfully. I really love seeing this entire thing, but they're trying to get him trapped up in breaking the Sabbath. They accused his disciples of breaking the Sabbath. They're accusing him of breaking the Sabbath by healing on the Sabbath. All of these things Jesus defends perfectly. But then you get to Matthew chapter 12, verse 31. And I think it's important to understand that, so I've really been thinking on this one, and it may so Matthew chapter 12, verse 24. In Matthew chapter, yes, Jesus did heal on the Sabbath. You can read about that in Matthew 12, verse 9 through 13. But in Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, this is the buildup. So the entire situation, Jesus is, in the last couple of chapters, Jesus is building his resume. He's showing them his credentials. He is saying, this is what I am, and I'm telling you who I am by showing you what I can do. He's like, nobody else can do the things I'm doing. I control the wind. I control the sea. I have power over death. I literally just said to a girl, little girl, arise. You guys think that that's just like a normal thing? Like, am I taking crazy pills? You see him healing the leper. You see him casting out demons out of a mute man. He's like, what else can I do to you guys and show you? What else can I do to prove to you guys? And so that's basically what he's doing. And so that's the buildup all the way to Matthew chapter 12, verse 24. And so since that's the buildup, now we can read Matthew chapter 12, verse 24 with a little bit of better understanding, because this is where the rejection comes in. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 24, it says this. Now, when the Pharisees heard it, they said, this fellow does not cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of the demons. So what they're doing here is they are crediting Jesus, all the casting out of demons, all of those things. The Pharisees were giving the credit to Satan. They were giving the credit of all of Jesus' things to Satan. They were saying what Jesus is doing is by the power of Satan, because they couldn't not acknowledge it. They're like, this is clearly, they're trying to balance the crowds. They're like, all these people, we're losing people, guys. I'm losing followers. Like, I'm not getting as many likes on my videos. Like, I got to do something. Ha, ha, ha. Satanic, right? And so that's what they ended up doing. And so that is what they called Jesus. And so it's interesting to see how big that was. Like, that's just a verse to you and I. We read that verse and we're like, okay, yeah, it's like the cast out demons except by Beelzebub, the ruler of demons, or But man, the impact that this actually had when you understand and remember that Jesus is God Almighty. When you understand that Jesus is God Almighty, and He's doing everything perfectly. And then these people who are misguiding the Jewish people, right? Like his mission was to the lost sheep of Israel, right? Like that is who he was here for. His goal, his ministry was to Israel. And so since that's who he was here for, and then he sees these Pharisees talk to him and say, you cast out demons by using demons. Can you imagine how that would come across to the God of the universe, to Jesus standing right in front of you, and you're like, you're going to tell me that what I'm doing is satanic? And so this is the buildup. This is the complete buildup to this unpardonable sin, which is really interesting. All I'm saying here, just before we dive into this, is that this is just a way to consider things. Like, again, test all things. But obviously, we understand that rejecting the Holy Spirit is unforgivable. If you die and you have never put your faith and your trust and your hope in Jesus Christ, when you die, you're lost. It's done. It's done. There's no getting out of it. You can't have somebody pray you out of, there's no purgatory. There's none of that situation. When you reject the Holy Spirit, when you refuse to put your trust in Christ, you're done. If you die that way. But that goes without saying. We all know that. But here, this unpardonable sin, I think, is I think there's a lot more to it. And so, there's certain sin that was unpardonable when it comes to punishment, is what I'm trying to get here. Like there's a spiritual side to it. Obviously, like if you reject the Holy Spirit for your entire life and then you die that way, that's the spiritual side to it. Obviously, you're not going to heaven. But the physical side is what I'm kind of attributing this unpardonable sin. Because when you look into this, the first 12 chapters up into this point, you'll see this generation. You'll see the phrase, this generation. What shall I liken this generation to? Because he says that at the end of chapter 12, he says this generation multiple times. But what I want you to understand is that in Kadesh Barnea, I keep going back to Kadesh Barnea because the Israelites were wandering through the wilderness, and then they keep on complaining, and then God is talking to Moses, and he's like, how many times, how long am I going to have to deal with all of this complaining? And then the people in the wilderness, they basically keep on complaining, and then God says that they're not going to be able to enter the promised land, essentially, and I'm just paraphrasing here. But then what happens after that is that the Israelites repent. They ask for forgiveness. So, but it was already too late, is what I'm saying. Now, did God forgive them of their sins? Absolutely. He will always forgive. Like he wants nothing more than to forgive. That's in his nature. He wants to forgive. You just need to ask. You have not because you ask not. So what I'm saying is that there was a line in the sand that they crossed, and then they repented. And God's like, I forgive you, but you already crossed this line way back here. And because you crossed this line, there is a physical judgment that is going to happen. This has nothing to, like, spiritually, like you're okay, but there's a physical price that's going to be paid. And that's what Kadesh Barnea is talking about in Numbers 13 and 14. And so here in Matthew chapter 12, verse 31, this is like the buildup to the rejection of Jesus when Jesus rides into town on a donkey. Do you remember in Luke chapter 19 when Jesus rides into Jerusalem on a donkey and he says, oh, Jerusalem, if you had known even this your day that makes for your peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. And so he basically prophesies over them that they will be blind. And so that blindness was an effect from that moment, and it's still on them to this point. They're kind of like, they can see, some of them can see, the majority of them cannot see. And so it's really interesting because what that prophecy did is that you need to understand in Luke 19, there was a multitude out there like saying, Hosanna, blessed is he. Like they were doing that. But it was too late because they already rejected it. Nationally, they rejected Jesus. And so that is why Jesus looked over the city. He's like, you guys are still waiting for the Messiah. I already did everything that I possibly could. And so it's fascinating to see this whole situation where Jesus prophesies over them and says that this is unstoppable. And what he said was going to happen was the fall of Jerusalem and the temple, which occurred in 70 AD. And so that fall that he prophesied about was unpardonable. It was unpardonable. That physical sin was unpardonable. And so that is what I'm trying to get you to understand, or at least think. I'm not telling you to think this way. I'm test it, obviously. But that was an unpardonable sin in Numbers 13 and 14. Another one was King Manasseh. King Manasseh was the worst king of Israel. I mean, he had all kinds of people sacrifices and stuff like that. You had all these things. Don't want to say too many things, but there's all kinds of terrible stuff under King Manasseh. King Manasseh lived his whole life terrible. He was a terrible king. He was the worst one, right? But then he repented, but it was too late. He already crossed the line, and so he got punished for it. There was an unpardonable sin. And so, I'm just trying to draw a connection. Like, I just feel like there's something there, man. Like, I just think it's just so interesting because when Jesus, for example, when Jesus prophesied over Jerusalem and he said that he's like, this is going to happen. That was unpardonable. It was unpardonable. It was going to happen because they missed the time of their visitation. I hope that makes sense to you guys. Like, I'm not trying to rewrite the wheel or rebuild the wheel, reinvent the wheel, whatever it's called. I am just proposing to you that an unpardonable sin doesn't just mean spiritually. And, obviously it makes sense spiritually. Everybody understands that. And that is very true. I'm just saying that physically, there's a line in the sand that they can't come back from when it comes to this physical condemnation. And that physical condemnation came in the form of the Roman invasion, which took place, and they got defeated in 70 AD, and the temple fell. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Very, very interesting in my mind. Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13 is what we talked about last time. Matthew chapter 13 are these kingdom parables. And so there's a lot of stuff here in Matthew chapter 13. And Matthew chapter 13 is tough to talk on. Just because it goes, like, you read the first 8 verses and then it forces you to go to the last half of the chapter and read more verses for the explanation, and then you go back and forth, back and forth. Well, we did the best that we can, but you have all of these parables. And what you learn here in Matthew chapter 13, verse 11, well, the question is, why is Jesus talking in parables? Why is he doing that? It's because everything changed after Matthew chapter 12. Because in Matthew chapter 12, that was the rejection. That was like they rejected Jesus. They had this whole situation. It was a turning point. And so Jesus understood that there was a situation, everything changed. And so because Jesus understood it, he's like, now I'm not going to talk to you straight up anymore. I'm going to talk to you in parables. It was a whole shifting of the message. And so in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus speaks to the people in parables, but he explains the parables in private. So he'll speak to everybody in parables, but he won't give them the explanation, but he'll give his disciples the explanation. So if you were just a random person in the crowd and you heard Jesus speaking, you'd be like, I don't understand. But in Matthew chapter 13, verse 10, it says this, and the disciples came to him and said, why do you speak to them in parables? Matthew chapter 13, verse 11 says, he answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. So Jesus is drawing a line in the sand, and he's saying, my people understand what I'm saying. The people who are not mine do not understand what I'm saying. And so you have two different groups, people who can hear and people who cannot hear. And that's why he says in Matthew chapter 13, verse 9, he says, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. Because there's people who cannot hear, and there's people who will not hear. And so these parables are for his people. And so, and that's what he's saying here in verse 11. But these parables are very they're basically painting a picture, like a huge long picture of the entire kingdom and how it's from start to finish, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But there are two different hey, thank you, Jules. There are two different one parable talks about the parable of the in Matthew chapter 13 verse 1 through 8. It talks about the sower and the soils. And so you have these four different soils, and the explanation for it is all the way over in verse 20 through 23. He gives you the explanation all the way over there. But you have these four soils. And so the way I want you to view this whole situation, just like with a broad sense, you have a field. The field is what? The field is the world. And so I want you to imagine you have 1 acre of land. And this acre is a garden. You have a garden. You're looking at it. You're standing in this garden. You're looking around. And you're like, okay, this is my garden. You got like a piece of straw hanging out of your mouth. You're like, I have no idea what I'm doing. But you're in this garden. And then you have seed. And you go and you spread seed all over the place. And as you're spreading the seed, you're noticing that some parts of the ground are like harder than the others, and like you're like walking on it and you're like, oh man, like it doesn't take a rocket science to like be walking through a field and be like, oh, that's good soil and that's bad soil, right? So you're walking around, you're like throwing the seed all over the place. Some seed falls over here, some seed falls over here sometimes, and so you have to like make your own conclusion as far as what these like what's going on here. But it gives you the explanation in verse 19 through 23. Some people see that the seed, none of the seed is alive. Some people say that these are all referring to lost people, except for the good except for the good soil. And other people see that there is life in the soil where the seed sprouted and then got choked. And so, I think personally, like if there's growth, that means that there's life. And if there's life, then I think you're good, but I just think that you're not going to be optimized for doing what you should be doing. And so if you're not doing, like, you can have life and not have any fruit. I mean, think about it. Have you ever, imagine planting an apple tree. You plant an apple tree and it grows, it's like a foot tall, and you're like, I did it, right? And then, like a lawnmower comes and like runs it over and it's just like gone. You're just like, I'm heartbroken, right? And so there's no fruit. Like, you had life, but there was no fruit. And so that's the whole point of what we should be striving for. Not staying on milk our entire life as a Christian. We need to be growing. And so just like an infant, when you have a child, you give them milk and then they get bigger. Next thing you know, they're eating, steak and potatoes and all kinds of stuff. And so, so it's just interesting to try to figure out, like, where do you guys land on that one? That's something that you can figure out for yourself. But when you go to Matthew chapter 24, in Matthew chapter 24, it talks about the wheat and the tares. And so what you see there is two different seed. You have two different kinds of seed. And so anything that is real is going to be counterfeited. If I have a real, like, people don't go around counterfeiting, bubble gum wrappers, right? Like, why? Because there's no value in doing that. But what people do counterfeit is with things that do have value. And so here you have the Word of God, which is of the most value, and it is being counterfeited all over the place. And so you're having all of these false doctrines and like the doctrine of men and traditions of man and all these things. And it's a complete distraction. But anyways, Matthew chapter 13, verse 24 through 30, you have these two different types of seed that are, GMOs that are being contrasted here. Matthew chapter 13, verse 31, where we are talking about the mustard seed, which is very fascinating because you have this mustard seed and you see that there are birds of the air that come and nest in its branches in Matthew chapter 13, verse 32. And so what is going on there in Matthew chapter 13, verse 32, where these birds of the air come and nest in its branches? Birds rarely build a nest in a tree that is close to the ground. Like if you have like a little, like a 2 or 3 foot high bush, like you might find like a little bird's nest in there, but it's not a common thing. Most times birds go up into big trees to where they're higher off the ground to where predators can't get up and get them, right? Well, what we know about these birds that are in this mustard tree is that what the birds represent. We've learned in Matthew chapter 13, Jesus tells us that the birds represent the agents of evil. They're agents of Satan. And so these birds, or these agents of Satan, are nesting. They are building their homes in this mustard tree. What is the mustard tree? The mustard tree seems to represent the church. And so you see this whole church getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's worldwide. And so this is this huge tree of the church. But then you see these agents of evil, or agents of Satan, getting inside of it and living inside that tree and just doing all kinds of havoc inside of it. And so that's kind of what's going on there in Matthew chapter 13, verse 32. The next parable, you have the parable of the leaven. Now, what's fascinating about this is, what does leaven represent? The leaven represents sin. And so you see that this woman is adding leaven to it. It's, what is going on with that? This whole thing, if you were a Jew, you would be shooketh. You'd be like, she did what? And you'd be like, oh my goodness, she added leaven. What's up, Josh? How you doing, man? And so she added leaven to these 3 measures of meal in Matthew 13, verse 33. And this would make a Jew completely gasp, because it should be unleavened. And so you need to understand that. It's unleavened. It needs to be unleavened, but she's adding sin to it. She's adding leaven to it. And what does leaven do? It's representative of pride. Pride puffs up. Leaven puffs up. That's why you add leaven to bread. It puffs it up. And so that's why we want unleavened bread. But that's what that parable is talking about. Then we go to Matthew chapter 13, verse 44. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 44, it says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. And I kind of wanted to talk about this because we just talked about this like 2 days ago, and I kind of wanted to talk on it again. Because I feel like there's some things I didn't talk about, but it says in verse 44, it says, again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. So this treasure, it seems to be representing Israel, seems to be representing the Jewish people. Let's go to Exodus 19, verse 5. Exodus 19, verse 5. And so in Exodus 19, verse 5, speaking of treasure, in Exodus 19, verse 5, it says this, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. And so you have this treasure seeming to represent the Jewish people. And I think that's very important to pay attention to, just because of what we're going to be diving into verse 45. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 45, if the hidden treasure in verse 44 represents Israel, Matthew chapter 13, verse 45 talks about this pearl of great price. Now, we talked about how this pearl represents, it comes from an oyster. An oyster from the Jewish people is unclean. It's not something that relates to the Jewish people. So if the treasure in verse 44 represents Israel, then this pearl of great price represents the Gentile believers, it seems to be. And so I think that's very interesting to see how that is plays out. Let's go to Acts chapter 15, verse 14. Acts chapter 15, verse 14. In Acts chapter 15, verse 14, it says this. Paul says this. Acts chapter 15, verse 14, Paul says, Simon has declared how God at the first visited the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. So that seems to be speaking of the church age in a roundabout way, because these Gentiles, I know that, in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Gentile. But in these parables, the treasure in Matthew 13, verse 44, seems to represent Israel, and the pearl of great price seems to represent the Gentile believers. Both very specific in Scripture. Then, let's see. We talked about the dragnet. Okay, so a summary of the parables in Matthew 13, because that's what we just got done doing last time we went live. But a summary of the parables basically allows us to see the movement of the mystery kingdom from start to finish. So what I mean is, in the beginning, you see the seed is being sown. You see the seed is being sown, and then the seed grows and it grows, and some grows differently. When some gets choked, some gets scorched, some gets all, and then other seed grows. You're looking at a field. You're standing in this field that you own, and you're looking around. You see some growth over here. You're seeing other growth at different levels all over the place. And so you see differences in the growth. But then the seed turns into wheat, or it turns into tares. Because what you read in Matthew chapter 13, verse 25, Matthew chapter 13, verse 25, 26, and 27, is that there were tares that were sown into the good seed. So you're looking into this field, you're seeing some wheat, you're seeing some tares, and it's all growing at different levels, but there's different sections within the field. And so this field represents the world, the treasure represents the Jews, the pearl represents the Gentiles, and then we obviously know that at the end of this mystery kingdom that there's going to be a separation of these things. There's going to be a separation from the wheat and the tares. There's going to be a separation from the good fish and the bad fish. And so it's pretty much like a flyby of, from start to finish, of this mystery kingdom. And so that is what is going to lead us into Matthew chapter 14. Okay, so that's Matthew chapter 1 through 13. That's the recap in a roundabout way. We didn't talk on everything, but we normally don't. But hopefully that helps in some kind of capacity. Okay, so let's go ahead. What's up, Eli? Good to see you, man. Hello, Sherry. Fellowship certainly is a great point. Yeah, big time. Okay, GMOs. What's up, Amanda? Hey, thanks. Okay. Yeah, I think it's fruit. Absolutely. I think was that you, Respiratory, who asked about the fruit? I think it's absolutely fruit. It's like we're all trying to learn and grow. And so when you grow, I was talking to my buddy the other day, and I told him, man, I told him, I was like, we're all at different walks in our life, and we handle things differently. And I was encouraging him to get back in walk with God, because I said, I was like, how's your walk? And he said something along the lines of, it's non-existent. And I was like, oh man, been there. And I said, what's funny about that is that we know, like, if you're a born again believer, you know that if you dedicate your time and energy into learning about the one who saved you, you're going to be worked on. You know that. You know you're going to be worked on. It's impossible to dive in and just be like, okay, Lord, help me understand. I'm going to put in time. I'm going to put forth energy trying to learn, because when I do, I'm going to be worked on. And I'm telling you what, I am being worked on. And I'm like, dude, I'm like telling you, like, in order, like, to try to figure life out, like, you have to first allow yourself to be worked on. And so when you dive into the word and you start allowing this to get in here, it's going to work on you, and then your life's going to change. And so that is fruit. That is going to be, that is going to bring forth fruit, because when you allow your life to be worked on, you're going to be a walking billboard in your world on change. And then people are going to be like, well, what changed? And then you'll be able to tell them all about Jesus. What's up, Dina? Okay, so that is Matthew chapter 13. I am in the trenches for real. Hey, thank you, Sherry. Thank you so much. So, learning and gaining this kind of information, or biblical information, is is essential. Okay, so let's go ahead and dive on into Matthew chapter 14. But just in case you guys are new here, thank you so much for being here. My name's Ryan, and we're just doing a verse-by-verse Bible study. I don't know everything. I'm never going to know everything. And I just think it's, what's up, Donnie? Hello from New Orleans. I just want you to understand I don't know everything, and I never will, but I want you to always remember to test everything that I say. Test it all. I'm giving you my way of thinking, and a lot of times it's not going to align with your way of thinking. And so maybe you know something I don't, or maybe I know something you don't, but one way or the other, it's going to be on you and I to look into it and search it out. All of these studies are up on YouTube. Thank you, Mark. And this is my YouTube right here, ITZ_sheesh. So if you wanted to go check out that is an option for you. We've done Revelation, Daniel, Ruth, Hebrews, James, John, Acts, all of the Pauline epistles. We've done Isaiah, and we've done Zechariah, and now we are in the book of Matthew. So all that is there. Hey, thanks, Rooted. And so all that is up on YouTube if you wanted to go check that out. That is a tool for you. We just go through the Bible book by book, verse by verse, and I think that's really challenging to do. And so we're just trying to figure it out as we go. But I feel like we do a pretty good job. And so thank you guys for being here. The one thing I want you to understand more than anything else, though, is how to know for sure you can get to heaven. If you don't have that, then you have nothing. And so you're building on nothing. Your foundation is sand. And so you need to have Christ as your foundation. So how do you get to heaven? Well, you need to understand that you're a sinner and that you can't get to heaven with sin. And so how do you remedy that situation? Well, that's where Jesus comes in, because you need to understand and believe that Jesus is God's son, that he led a sinless life, and that he died on the cross for your sins, that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day. And the Bible says, for whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. It is for by grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. That is what you need to understand. It's not Christ plus water baptism. It's not Christ plus going to church once or twice a week. It's not Christ plus helping or giving money to your church. It's not Christ plus. No, it is putting your faith in Christ and Christ alone and his completed work on the cross. And John 3:16 is a wonderful verse. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And so I want you to understand that more than anything else. That is quite literally the primary issue of the entire Bible. If you don't have that, you have nothing. And so if you have any questions about that, feel free to reach out to me here on TikTok. My message, you don't even have to follow me. Like, I don't care if you have any, my messages are open to everybody and anybody. But if you have any questions on that issue or any other biblical thing or whatever, just feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you. So, all right, let's go ahead and dive into Matthew chapter 14. So Matthew chapter 14, we're going to be talking about John the Baptist, and what's a kind of like a good kind of way, or a good way to view things is that what happens to the herald, which is John the Baptist. Remember that John the Baptist was the forerunner to Jesus Christ. What happens to that John the Baptist, whatever happens to the herald, is going to happen to the king. And so we know, you guys already know this by now, because I know you guys are educated. You got a really smart, a lot of smart people in here. You guys know that John the Baptist gets beheaded. Spoiler alert if you didn't know that, but that is what ends up happening. And so in Matthew chapter 14, verse 1, it says this. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 1, it says, at that time, Herod, the tetrarch, heard the report about Jesus. Okay, so let's stop right there for a little bit and let's talk about Herod, because we've talked about Herod, and it can kind of get a little confusing because there's a lot of Herods. Let's say it's Herod. It's the equivalent of saying Johnson or Smith or Carpenter or another, whatever your last name is. You know, it's the equivalent of that. Here you have Herod. And so there were multiple Herods that were rulers, and they were all bad. That's the one thing that's the kind of helps everything. Like, they're all bad. These Herods, or these Smiths, or these whatever, these Herods were all bad. But they all stem from Herod the Great. And so you need to understand that this Herod that we're talking about here in chapter 14 is not Herod the Great. So if you go back to let's go back to Matthew chapter 2. just so you can see a different one. In Matthew chapter 2, do you guys remember in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1? In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king." So there you have Herod the king. This is not the same Herod that we're reading about in Matthew 14. Matthew chapter 2 is talking about Herod the Great. So Herod the Great, from Herod the Great, that is where all of these other people stem from. That's where Herod the Tetrarch and all the other Herods come from, Herod the Great. Herod the Great was king. But Herod the Great was the son of Antipater. Do you remember when we went through the whole backstory? And if you were here for the whole backstory, the history portion of it, Antipater, it goes all the way back to the Roman Empire. During the Roman Empire, there was a civil war that broke out. And during this civil war that broke out, Pompey started a civil war inside the Roman Empire and going against Caesar. So Pompey is going against Caesar, and Caesar eventually defeated Pompey. But Caesar had some loyal people that were beneath him, and Antipater was one of them. So Antipater was rewarded by Caesar, and he gave Antipater a region of the Roman Empire to be in charge of. And so Antipater was put in charge of Judea, in a sense, or in that region. And so Antipater had some sons. And so if you're a father and you have some sons, you're going to want your sons to be in certain specific strategic, powerful positions if you can. And so that is where Herod the Great comes in, because Antipater had a son named Herod, and he had his son become king of Judea. And so he was appointed king of Judea, and that was Herod the Great. So Herod the Great becomes king of Judea. He's appointed king of Judea. And what's also important to understand is that they are all Edomites. And when you think of Edomites, what do you think of? You probably think of Esau, right? So Edomites, if you know anything about the Edomites, you understand that there is a specific book, like the book of Obadiah. It's geared about some revenge that is going to be unleashed on Edom. And so it's just really interesting to understand that. But these Herods, they pretended to be Jewish people. They tried to smooth over the transition, because you have a Gentile. King Herod was a Gentile. He comes in and now he's appointed over the Jewish people. So imagine being a Jew. You have this king being appointed over you, and you don't like him, but then he tries to make things better between you and him, and you're like, you know what? So how would he go about trying to make things better between you as the Jew and him as the king? Well, he would build up your temple. That's what he ended up doing. He started expanding the temple. He started renovating it and making it more fancy. And he was doing that to try to build the relationship between the Jewish people. So that temple that Zerubbabel built was expanded and renovated by King Herod, or Herod the Great. And he was trying to do that to build relationships with the Jewish people. But they pretended to be Jews, but they weren't actually Jewish people. And if you go back and you read Matthew chapter 2, what you learn about Herod the Great is, what did Herod the Great do to the Jewish kids who were under the age of 2 years old? What did he have them do? What did he have everybody do? He unalived all of them because of the threat of the king of the Jews that was born king of the Jews. Now, Herod the Great, just focusing on Herod the Great, he was this, dude who you didn't want to get on his bad side. Basically, even if you were a son of Herod the Great, you were in grave danger. There's a quote out there that basically says that you had a better chance to survive if you were a swine, one of the swine of King Herod. Herod the Great, rather than being a son of Herod the Great. Because if Herod the Great had an inkling of suspicion that you were, conniving against him, he would end you. And so Herod the Great was a formidable person, not somebody that you would want to ever tick off, but he even killed his own sons, and if he ever suspected anything. But after the Herod the Great died, this is where Matthew chapter 14 comes into play. After Herod the Great died, his kingdom, Herod the Great's kingdom, was divided in 4 sections. There's 4 sections where his kingdom was divided. And so this is where Matthew chapter 14 comes into play, because Herod the Great divided his kingdom among his 3 sons. And so he had 3 sons. He had Herod Philip, he had Herod Antipas, and he had Herod Archelaus. So he had Herod Philip, Antipas, and Archelaus. And Herod Antipas was ruler over Galilee. And so that is who we are talking about here in Matthew chapter 14. We are talking about Herod Antipas, and he is ruler over Galilee. So with all that in mind, let's read Matthew chapter 14, verse 1. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 1, it says this: At that time, Herod Antipas, the tetrarch. Now, the word tetrarch just means governor. Like, it's a governor over the fourth of the kingdom. He had he had essentially had a fourth of a control over the entire kingdom from Herod the Great. So it says in Matthew chapter 14, verse 1, it says, At that time, Herod the tetrarch heard the report about Jesus and said to his servants, This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Now, what's going on here in verse 2 is that this already happened. John the Baptist already died. He's already dead. So what's going on here in these first couple verses is this is a flashback. So John is already dead, and he's having a flashback to what had already been, which is John the Baptist dying. And we're about to get that story on how John the Baptist dies here. Let's keep reading. Matthew chapter 14, verse 3, it says this: For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Now, let's talk about Herodias for a little bit. Now, Herodias was not somebody that's just, you want to just, this person, unbelievable. Well, Herodias, she married her uncle Philip. Let that sink in for a little bit. She married her uncle Philip. Then she divorced him and married his brother, who was Herod Antipas. So there's all kinds of, all 3 of these people. You have Philip, you have Antipas, and you have Herodias. All 3 of these people are related. So this is an incestuous relationship. Terrible, unbelievable. This kind of stuff, right? Like, gross. So what's going on here is why was John actually, why was he unalived by Herod? It's because John publicly denounces this relationship. He just, everything we know about John the Baptist, which is very little, by the way, is that he is very direct and he's very confrontational. And so let's go to Mark chapter 6, verse 18. Go to Mark chapter 6, verse 18, so we can see it in Mark's words. Mark chapter 6, verse 18. Mark chapter 6, verse 18. It says this in Mark chapter 6, verse 18. It says, Because John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Okay, so that's the situation, what's going on here. Now let's go back to Matthew chapter 14, and let's pick it up in verse 4. Matthew chapter 14, verse 4, it says this: Because John had said to him, It is not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude, because they counted him as a prophet. I think it's interesting in verse 5 to remember who we are dealing with here when it comes to John the Baptist. John the Baptist, you have Herod that is saying that he feared the multitude. He is fearing the multitude. I think it's good to know that. Sorry, my buddy is blowing up my phone right now with text messages. But he feared the multitude. It's important to understand and remember that John had a ton of people following him, and they counted him as a prophet. So this multitude was something that you don't want to deal with if you are the governor at this point, which is what Herod the Tetrarch was. He was the governor of this specific region. So Herod Antipas, this governor, doesn't want to deal with this multitude, and he understood that. So let's with all that in mind, let's go to verse 6. In verse 6, it says, But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias, danced before them and pleased Herod. And so what you have going on here is John the Baptist is very publicly denouncing the incestuous relationship between Herodias, between Herodias and Philip, and between Herodias and Antipas. There's a lot of weird names going on here. It's uncommon to say these names, so it's really challenging. If you dive into this whole lineage, there's a whole bunch of, there's Herod Philip, there's Herod Philip II, there's Herod Agrippa, there's all these Herods, and so it gets really confusing. So if you dive into that, good luck. But I just want you to remember that from Herodias's point of view, she is not happy with it. She is wanting revenge for being called out publicly by a very influential person, by a very influential prophet. And so she, it's also good to remember that the Herods, all of these Herods, they professed to be Jewish, but they really weren't. And so in verse 6, Matthew chapter 14, verse 6, it says, "But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them, and it pleased Herod." Now, what's interesting about this daughter dancing is that she was essentially a princess. In this scene, if you want to visualize that, like you have Herod, who is the governor, the tetrarch. He is a high-ranking dude, right? And so you have the daughter of Herodias dancing. This is a big deal. Like this lady, this girl is not just like some, no, this is not just somebody off the road or somebody off the streets. This was somebody that had some influence, and she's dancing before Herod on his birthday. And it was kind of common back then for them to kind of flex a little bit. So Herod is like, you know what, I'm going to flex a little bit on my birthday, and I'm just going to do something kind of crazy, and I'm just going to be like, hey, what do you want? Up to half my kingdom, what do you want? I will give it to you. So in here in Matthew chapter 14, verse 7, it says, "Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask." Now we learn in the other Gospels that it was up to half the kingdom, so it wasn't everything. This is just Matthew's account. But in Matthew chapter 14, verse 8, it says this, "So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, 'Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter.' And the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison." Now, this is very interesting because I want you to remember that there's a lot of people out there who say we should be happy and we should get what we want, and I should do what I want to do. And I think it's important that I do what I want to do, and I think God wants me to be happy. Well, it's always good to challenge everything to Scripture, and so when you use that type of arguments and you apply it to the Word, what do you see? What do you see the people who are closest to Jesus? What do you see them doing? You see them suffering. You see them going through it. You see them like doing whatever they have to and keep it on pushing through whatever they're dealing with, whatever tribulation they're dealing with. And so here John did what he was supposed to do. He played his part. He did what he was supposed to do. And I'm supposed to do what I'm supposed to do. And you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do if you're a child of God. And so here, it's just so interesting to read in verse 10. It says, "So he sent and had John beheaded in prison." That's a very brief sentence, but there is, imagine, just use your imagination here. Imagine hearing the clanking of the chains, about the people like walking down into the dungeon or whatever you imagine it to be, and you hear the footsteps and the people coming to them, and then you hear the keys clanking together, and you hear the lock unlocking and the door squeaking when it opens, and you hear them grab John the Baptist, and the build up and the build up and the build up and the build up and the build up. We don't get that. We get one sentence that says, we get one sentence that says, "So he sent and had John beheaded in prison." Very brief, very tragic. And this sent shockwaves throughout the city. John the Baptist was a giant during this time. He's an absolute giant. but it sent shockwaves throughout the land. Let's go to verse 11. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 11, it says, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it, and went and told Jesus. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick. Now, there's going to be some really interesting things that we're going to talk about at the end of Matthew chapter 14, but you need to pay attention to every detail here. You need to pay attention to every detail in Matthew chapter 14, because we're going to bring it back at the end, and I'm going to ask you guys to see if you see something, because I think it's very interesting, and I think there's something there. I'm not like going to be dogmatic about it, but I think I'm going to mention it nonetheless, because I think it's rather fascinating. But just pay attention to the details as we go. Let's go on to Matthew chapter 14, verse 15. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 15, it continues and says, when it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. But Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Now, what's interesting about verse 16, no, I wasn't thinking that you guys weren't listening, Eli. I was just saying it just because of where we're going with this. But here in verse 16, Jesus tells his disciples, he says, you give them something to eat. And so what you need to understand up until this point, what Jesus has been doing with his disciples, is that Jesus had been training them up to this point. And so what do I mean by that? Let's go to Mark chapter 5, verse 30. Mark chapter 5, verse 30 and 31. Mark chapter 5, verse 30 and 31. I use Schofield Study Bible and New King James. Mark chapter 5, verse 30 and 31. In Mark chapter 5, verse 30, it says, and Jesus, immediately knowing himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, you see the multitude thronging you, and you say, who touched me? So what I'm saying here, as far as training wise, is that Jesus said that so that the disciples would focus in. Like, he knew who touched him. He didn't ask that question like, oh my goodness, who touched me? I'm so surprised. Like, that's not what he was doing at all. This is all part of training his disciples on how to do what Jesus was going to do, how to think how Jesus was thinking. Because that's one example right there to who touched me. He wanted to get their attention. And then the other one is in Matthew chapter 8, verse 24. In Matthew chapter 8, verse 24, you have this whole situation where they're on the boat. The sea gets all crazy. They're in this storm. And then in Matthew chapter 8, verse 26, or verse 25, Matthew chapter 8, verse 25, it says, then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us. We are perishing. Jesus knows this whole thing, right? So it's not something that is surprising to him. He didn't wake up and like, what's going on? What's happening? Oh my goodness, whoa. No, this is like, he's putting training wheels on his disciples, and he's letting them go through things just how you would let your son or your daughter go through things. You could go up to your child who's like 3 years old and like stop them from doing all the bad things and then never explain it to them. Or you could let them fall down, or you could let them mess up, or you could let the door come back and hit them in the face, and then, or they'll learn, right? They're going to learn. So here, what Jesus has been doing is he's training them. He is literally training them. Why is he training them? Because there's coming a point in Acts chapter 1, specifically, in other places as well, where Jesus is going to go away. He's going to leave. And so he's building them up, right? Like, he's telling them and showing them how to think. So going back to Matthew chapter 14, verse 16, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 16, it says, but Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Verse 17, it says, and they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. So here in verse 7, what I think is interesting, there's all kinds of connections here, okay? There's all kinds of really cool stuff. But just to draw on some of these connections, you have 5 loaves and you have 2 fish. Now, 5 plus 2 is 7, right? You have 5 loaves, 2 fish. And if you go down, if you go down to verse 20, in verse 20 it says, Matthew chapter 14, verse 20, it says, so they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets. So you have 5 plus 2, which equals 7. You have 7. And then you also have 12. Now, what's interesting about the number 7 and the number 12, is that we're told specifics. Like, these are numbers that, like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that didn't happen, or that did happen, that we're not told about. There's so many things that happened back then that we have no idea. But for some reason, we're told that there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. And that is important to understand, that we are told that for a reason. We're also told that there were 12 baskets. Now, it's interesting, going back to the tabernacle, if you guys remember, we talk about the tabernacle a lot. But when you would go into the tabernacle, which only the priest could go into the holy place, there is this holy place that the priest could go into. And then right in the next room was the Holy of Holy Place. So you have the whole tabernacle right here, but they're blocked off in 2 sections. The first section was the holy place. And right when the priest would go into the holy place, if they looked to the right, they would see a table with 12 pieces of bread on it. If they looked to the left, they would see a menorah, and the menorah was the candlestick, which had 7 candles on it, 7 lamps. And so you have 12 on the right, and you have 7 on the left. And so then when you would go forward, you had the altar and incense, then you would have the veil that separated from the holy place to the Holy of Holy Place, and then inside the Holy of Holy Place, you would have the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat being on top of it. But what I want you just to understand here is that you have the number 7 and you have the number 12. You have the 5 loaves and 2 fish, which equals 7, and then you have the 12 baskets remaining. 12, 7, connected to the tabernacle. You see these numbers. If I were just to ask you, if you know anything about the Bible, if I was just to come up to you and be like, hey, what comes to mind when I say the number 12 when it comes to when it's in context of the Bible? What comes to mind? You would be like, well, the tribes or the apostles. That's probably what you would say. And that's what everybody would say, because that's what it relates to. And so if that's what you would say, then good for you. But my point here is that there is a design. There is a design that's going on here, and we're told information, and this information are things that we clearly need to know. But these numbers coincide with the tabernacle. But here, let's go back to Matthew chapter 14. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 17, it says this, and they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now, if we go to the other accounts, Mark chapter 6, or is it I'm trying to find, is it Luke 9, where it says it's a boy? Okay, it's not important. Going back to Matthew chapter 14, squirrel. Hey, thank you, Jules. And Matthew chapter 14, going back to verse 17, it says, and they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, bring them here to me. And then he commanded the multitude to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples. And the disciples gave to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now, what's interesting about in verse 20 is that it says that they were filled. They were filled. The word there has the idea of being fully satisfied. So we know that there is, it tells us in verse 21, Matthew chapter 14, verse 21, that it says that there was 5,000 men, and that's not counting the women or children. So it's estimated from 10 to 15,000 is what people estimate on how many people were here. And so what I think, hey, thank you, Monica. What you have going on here is that you have this very small amount. You have very little that is given to Jesus. And I think it's really interesting because in one of the accounts, it tells us that whether it's the feeding of the 5,000 or the 4,000, I can't remember, but a little boy is the one who gives the food to Jesus. And so I think that's really interesting when you think about that. Like, it's not much. Like, it's like you're showing up and you show up and you're like, I don't really have much, but here's all I have. And so when you think about how that, like the very little that we can give, I think it's really important to remember, just think, let's go to Mark chapter 12, just thinking about what does Jesus need to do, or what does Jesus need to have in order to do something with? We know that he doesn't need anything because in Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Like, meaning there wasn't just a whole bunch of supplies out in the back and he's like, you know what, I'm going to take this and this and this and I'm going to build an earth with it. No, he spoke it into existence. He doesn't need anything. But in Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, speaking of how little, just kind of veering off a little bit. In Matthew chapter 12, verse 41, it says this: Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury, and many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. Then it says in verse 43, it says, So he called his disciples to himself and said to them, Assuredly I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who had given to the treasury, for they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty. But in all that she had, her whole livelihood. It's not about the amount that you give. There's a whole bunch of people that you and I basically judge just based off of our human ways and our human eyes. Like, we see people, we're like, oh, this person's doing so much and this person's doing so much. I need you to understand that there are people who do a lot less than you physically and do a lot less than me physically, and they're doing so much more from God's point of view. And I think that's very provocative to really let that sink in. There's people who really don't have anything who are doing so much more with how little they've been given. That woman who gave the 2 mites, which is basically like a couple pennies, that was everything to her. And she's giving it to Christ, and she gave it to God. It was her heart. It was where her heart posture was. And I think that's very important to understand. But going back to Matthew chapter 14, he didn't have much at all. He just had 5 loaves and he had 2 fish. Now, he doesn't need those things. Going back to John chapter 5, I think it is, it talks about how Jesus turned water into wine. All Jesus had there was the vase that held the water, and he just had the water. There was no grapes. He didn't have time to crush a whole bunch of grapes to get a whole bunch of, or to do whatever. He didn't have time for it to ferment, but he spoke it into existence and it happened. And so he doesn't need this stuff in order to do this miracle. He's just showing these people what he can do with what little he has. But in verse 20, it says, so they all ate and were filled. They were fully satisfied. And I think that's really cool. That's going to come back around when we get back to it. But it says, and they all took up 12 baskets full of fragments. Hey, thank you, Sherry. Let's go to Leviticus 24. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1. In Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1, it says this. We're drawing a connection to the 7 and the 12 here. So the 7 and the 12. Leviticus chapter 24, verse 1, it says this. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, command the children of Israel that they bring to you pure oil of pressed olives for the light, to make the lamps burn continually. Now, it's interesting because what we're reading about here is we're talking about the lampstand that is inside the tabernacle. And we're told that it's specifically supposed to be using olives for the light. Which what does olive oil represent? What does oil represent in the Bible? It's representing the Holy Spirit. So when you go to verse 3, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 3, it says, outside the veil of the testimony in the tabernacle of meeting, Aaron shall be in charge of it from evening until morning before the Lord continually. It shall be a statute forever in your generations. So it's specifically talking about the menorah, which has 7 candle lamps on it, 7 candlesticks on it. So there's your 7. But when we keep reading in verse 5, Leviticus chapter 24, verse 5, it says this, and you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake. So you have the 7 and you have the 12, which is right there, which is, in case you were wondering where you could see that, that is where you get another place in the Bible that mentions 12 and 7. Okay, let's go back to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14, verse 21. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 21, it says this, now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So like I said, there's probably more about 10,000 to 15,000 is what many people estimate. Okay, now we get to verse 22. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. Now, this is going to come back into play, but I want you to just focus in on what Jesus made them do. He basically commanded them to get into the boat. And that's important to really zoom in on here for, and that's going to come, it's going to be more clear when we get to the end of this chapter, but it's just really cool. Okay, so when you go to verse 22, thanks, Kathy. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, it says, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. And when he had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there. So here in verse 22, where it says he made his disciples get into the boat, I think it's really interesting because perhaps they didn't want to get into this boat because maybe they knew that there was a storm coming. Because, these people, like, they could read the weather. They understood, they were, fishermen by profession. But maybe they knew that a storm was coming. But again, they're being trained. Jesus is training them. He is telling them what to do, and so he's training them. So in verse 23, he went by himself. Hey, thank you, Angel. It tells us that he went by himself to be alone. Because in verse 23, it says he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, this is what he wanted to do before, because if you go back to verse 13, Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 13, it says when Jesus heard that John the Baptist had been killed, it says he departed from there by boat to a deserted place by himself. So he was trying to be by himself, and then the multitudes just started following him. And so he heals them all. He has compassion on all of them, which is unbelievable. While he's hurting because of his friend and his the forerunner, he has compassion and he heals him. But he goes back. I think that's very interesting. He went to be alone. They found him. He healed them. He did everything that he could for them. And then he tells his disciples to get on the boat. They go out on the boat, and then Jesus himself tells the multitude to go. He says, and when he had sent the multitudes away, in verse 23, when Jesus had sent the multitudes away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Now, when evening came, he was alone there. Verse 24, but the boat was now in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Now, in the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went to them walking on the sea. Okay, so here you have Jesus. He is approaching them. And I think it's like, can you imagine, like, being these disciples? First off, they already had the experience where they were in the boat before. And they're like, are you sure you want us to get back on a boat? You know what happened last time when you weren't with us? Like, the waves were getting all crazy. But what I think is really interesting is we see Jesus walking on the water here. Let's go to Daniel chapter 12. And so in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, this could possibly be Jesus. Some people see Jesus, some people don't. I'm just going to give it to you, and so you can decide for yourself. But in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, it says this, but you, Daniel, This is after, this is Daniel's getting all kinds of apocalyptic kind of information here. But in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4, it says this: "But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase." Kind of like what we're seeing today. Everybody knows what's going on across the world right when it happens. Sometimes before it happens. They tell us what's going to happen before it happens. It's wild. Verse 5, though, Daniel chapter 12, verse 5. In Daniel chapter 12, verse 5, it says this: "Then I, Daniel, looked, and there stood two others, one on this riverbank and the other on that riverbank." So you have these two angels. He's looking at them. There's one over there. There's one over there. And then verse 6, Daniel chapter 12, verse 6 says this: "And one said to the man clothed in linen." So this one's different. He describes that angel. He says there's an angel, there's an angel. But then he describes this other angel, air quotes. And it says, "And one said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters on the river, how long shall be the fulfillment of these wonders be?" Then I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the river. And so it's very fascinating to see this. And so that's what I want you to see there in Daniel chapter 12, verse 4 through 7. You see this man being described, and it's clearly seems to be distinct from the angels that is described in the, Daniel chapter 12, verse 5 and 6. This man seems to be different, and so some people see Jesus there, and you see Jesus above the waters. If that is Jesus, which I could totally see it, if that is Jesus, I think it's very interesting that he was above the waters, before he actually walked on the waters physically, and we know that because in Genesis we the Spirit hovered and whatnot. But when you go to back to Matthew chapter 14. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 25, it says, "Now in the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went to them, walking on the sea. And when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were troubled, saying, 'It is a ghost!' And they cried out for fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid.' And Peter answered him and said, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' So he said, 'Come.' And when Peter had come down out of the boat, he walked on the water to go to Jesus. But when he saw that the wind was boisterous, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, 'Lord, save me.' And immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, 'O you of little faith, why did you doubt?' And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased." Okay, so this is a story we're all very familiar with. But in verse 30, what I think is interesting is that while Peter was focused on Jesus, he was perfectly fine, right? Like, we know he was perfectly fine when he was focused on Jesus. But the Bible here in Matthew 14 specifically tells us when he began to sink. When did Peter begin to sink? When did he begin to sink into the water? It was when his focus shifted to the world. And I think that's very important to pay attention to, because when he lost his focus, he began to sink into the water. What's interesting about this entire thing is who was in control of the entire situation. You have these waves. It was very, what does it say? In verse 24, it says they were in the middle of the sea, tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary. Whatever that means, right? Like, what does that mean? The wind was contrary. But if you go to Hebrews chapter 1, which, we go here all the time because I think it's awesome. But in Hebrews chapter 1, the question, while Jesus is walking on the water, while the waves are all over the place and the wind is quote unquote contrary, in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, the question is who's in control? Who is in control while the winds were going crazy and the noises, and you know, like when you're outside and you see the thunder and the lightning and you can hear it gets eerily and it's quiet and you're like, oh man, it's wild, it's the calm before the storm. All of these things are happening. Who is in control? Hebrews chapter 1 verse 3, it says, who being the brightness of his glory and the express image of his person, and upholding all things by the word of his power. Upholding all things. When this storm, when this wind, when the waves were getting loud and it's crazy, it's getting darker outside, it's scary, you get a little intimidated. It is crazy to imagine that Jesus was right there and he was watching them. But he tells Peter to come out, and so when you think about this whole story, and you try to use your, throw a personal application on it, the question naturally arises when you put a personal application on it is, where is your focus? Where's your focus? Because Peter was doing well when he was focusing on the Lord. Now, what's interesting is that nothing changed when he was walking on that water when he was doing well, because he was focusing on the Lord. There was still wind, there were still waves all around him, but he was doing well when he was focusing on Jesus. So what changed when he started to sink? He took his eyes, he focused on other things, on the distractions, on the cares of this world. He was focusing on that. And when he started doing that, that is when he started going down. And so it's so instructive. Because you can, like we've talked about this before, but there are people who go through a gauntlet through life. They lose this person in their life. They lose this person in their life. They lose their job. Their house burns down. All of these things happen. And they're just over there, and they just have like this peace. And it's just like, it doesn't make any sense. How does that make any sense? But they have this peace. So the question is, where is your focus? And what kind of storm are you in? Because this storm, this was an actual physical, like a little literal storm. Well, what kind of storm are you in? This storm that we're in is this life, the fears of this world, all the anxieties, all the things like the what if this happens, oh man. And it's just crazy because Jesus is looking at Peter and he understands. Don't get me wrong, it's natural for us to do what we do because we're human. But there's a difference on building yourself up in Christ, clothing yourself just with the Word of God, just sinking into it. Because when this is your clothing, it is just so different when you go through those storms, because it is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. And it's so important. Matthew chapter 14, thank you, Sherry. Matthew chapter 14, verse 31. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 31, I think it's very important to really zoom in on this word, because Matthew chapter 14, verse 31, it says, and immediately. So right when he sinks down, right when he's falling, he says, Lord, save me. And I love the word immediately. He did not hesitate. Immediately, Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, oh, you of little faith. Now, what's interesting about this word immediately is the idea, I just love the picture. If you want to go to Luke chapter 15, verse 20, Luke chapter 15, verse 20, you have this story of the prodigal son. In Luke chapter 15, verse 20, you know that the son, he asks for his inheritance. He goes away, he blows all of his inheritance, and then he comes back to his father with his tail between his legs, essentially. He's just completely ashamed, and he's I'm so sorry, I'm just going to go back to my dad. But in Luke chapter 15, verse 20, it says this, and he arose and came to his father. But when he was still a great way off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran. You see, this is an immediate response from the father. And now I'm not I'm just drawing a connection to the immediate, the emergent of the entire situation. It was an emergent situation. He immediately was there and he cried out. And I think that there's a lot of things to cry out. It was an audible sound that he did when he said, Lord, save me. There's something to it. When you call upon me in the day of trouble, I will deliver you and you shall glorify me. It's like crying out. There's nothing wrong with it, if you're by yourself and you just cry out to him. It's really cool. God speaks to us through his word, and we can speak to him through prayer. He speaks to us through his word. Matthew chapter 14, verse 31, it says, and immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And I think, I know we've talked about this before, but remember, Peter's the only one who got out of the boat. And he says to Peter, the only one who got out of the boat, he says, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" I think that's hilarious. He said to Peter, the only one. I mean, like, I'd be like, what about those guys? They're still in the boat looking at me out here getting all wet. Like, what's going on? If you go to, he said, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" But if you go to Mark chapter 9, verse 24, and Mark chapter 9, verse 24, speaking of faith, like Jesus says, "Peter, you of little faith." Mark chapter 9, verse 24 says this, immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, "Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief." Help my unbelief. There's there's all kinds of doubts and there's all kinds of worries and fears and anxiety that kind of creep in. And there's the weight of the world. Hey, thank you, Yogi. There's the weight of the world that is just compounding on top of us. It's not meant to be this way. And we need to acknowledge it. It's not meant to be this way. But when you understand that this is how it is for this while we're here on this earth, during this short period of time, this very temporary situation, during this light affliction that we're enduring, it's natural. And so Peter is called, or Jesus says to Peter, "Oh, you of little faith." And then you see that man in Mark 9:24, he's asking, "Lord, help my unbelief." And I think that's really important and instructive for you and I, because I'm sure there's people in here who struggle, me too, like we all do at different times, different periods. But I'm telling you, the further you are from God, the more you're going to worry, the more anxiety is going to be very evident in your life, the more fearful you're going to be. But the closer you are to Jesus, the more you keep your eyes on Jesus during this dark time in our world, you're going to be firm. And I think that's very cool. Mark chapter 14, verse 31. In Mark chapter 14, verse 31, it says, and immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" Verse 32, it says, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Wow. It tells us that the wind ceased, and I just think it's so. I want you to imagine you're in that boat in the wind, and you're rocking, and you're looking at what's going on out there, and you're getting sprayed in the face, like water's hitting you in the face, and you're looking out there, and Peter's walking on the water, and then he goes down, but Jesus catches him. Woo! Right? And then they come back and they get into the boat, and then all of a sudden, calm. That is amazing. That's an amazing thing. Right when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. Immediate. It wasn't a slow down kind of. It was. I want you to imagine. You know how you turn your fan off, and then it takes 30 seconds for it to finally come to a stop, and then it is instantaneous. It completely comes to a stop. There is no continuation of that wind. It ceased. And I think that peace, there's this peace, and it's so cool. Let's go to Romans chapter 5, verse 1. In Romans chapter 5, verse 1, which is a very important verse to know, in Romans chapter 5, verse 1, it says, therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. We have peace. The wind ceased. It was a peace. There was this great calm that just naturally. Can you imagine the calmness that just was dripping over them when that occurred? What was going through their minds? These 12 apostles inside the boat watching this, and they're just all of a sudden the wind ceased, and it's just boom. There's this peace. There's this great calm. In Mark's account, when you read about how, all the disciples were on the boat and they wake Jesus up and they're like, Jesus, do you not care that we're perishing? He wakes up, he rebukes them, and it says there was a great calm. There was a great calm, is how Mark describes it. A great calm. It wasn't just it was just like a slow, kind of, finally there was a calm. There was a great calm. And I think that is so neat. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33. Because, Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 33, it says, "For God is not the author of confusion, but of peace." God is the author of peace. It was natural for that to occur. Like, that is who he is. The God of peace. The Prince of Peace. Going back to Matthew chapter 14, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 33, Matthew chapter 14, verse 33 says, "Then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" You know that this actually happened? There's people in the world who, like to say, "Oh, I believe the Bible is kind of true. There's some things that are true. There's some things that aren't. I think it's basic. There's some stories in there that's, not necessarily true." Just so you know where I come from, I believe that this Bible is 100% true. I think that when people live in a world where they say that some of the majority of it is true, but not all of it is true, I think they don't understand what that actually implies, because what they're saying, if they believe that not all of it is true, is that they are the ones who become the judge of what is real and what is not. They're the ones who say, "This is right, this is not. I agree with this. This is good, but this is not good." And so this is real. This actually happened. But it says truly, they worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is his divine title. We talked about before, the Son of David. Son of David, have mercy. Son of David is the messianic title. That's the Son of David, the messianic title. The Son of God is his divine title. Then you have the Son of Man. Hey, thank you, Bubba. Then you have the Son of Man. The Son of Man is his relating to humankind. That is how he relates to us. He is our Goel. He became one of us. It's crazy. He is the kinsman redeemer. In order to fulfill that role, he needed to be a relative. And so it is so interesting to see this kind of stuff. But here they refer to him as the Son of God. And they use his divine name. Going back to Matthew chapter 14. Thank you, Bubba. Thank you. Matthew chapter 14, verse 34. Matthew chapter 13, verse 34, it says, "When they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they set out into all the surrounding region, brought to him all who were sick, and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. And as many as touched it were made perfectly well." Now, it's really interesting because a couple chapters ago when we went live, we were talking about, I proposed to you the idea of the woman who was sick. I said that there's a possibility that she was Gentile, just because I personally believe that she wouldn't be allowed into that crowd, touching everybody, getting through just so she could touch Jesus's garments. And so some people see that woman as a Jewish woman, and some people see it as a Gentile woman. It's completely fine either way. But here in Matthew chapter 14, verse 35, it says, "Into all that surrounding region brought to him all who were sick." And that surrounding region, all that were sick, you have to imagine that they weren't all Jewish people. I would say that the majority of them were Jewish people, but I would say that it would not be all Jewish people here. And so in verse 36, it says, "And begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment." Now, the hem of his garment, it's like the furthest part of his clothing that is away from his body. It's just like at his feet. It's called the tzitzit. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. But it's the little tassels, and so they would touch those tassels, and so some people say that only Jewish people would know to touch those tassels. And I can totally see that. And, it's interesting. One day we'll find out. This is a completely secondary issue, but, I know things about the Jewish people, and I am a Gentile. I know a little bit about the Jewish people, and I know this. So you would have to understand, or at least acknowledge, I suppose, you would have to at least acknowledge that Gentiles understood the Jewish culture. You remember the centurion that Luke describes in his account, that he basically is an advocate for the centurion, and he's like, this is a friend of the Jewish people. He even built us a synagogue. And so you see this whole situation where there are friends of the Jewish people, and if they're friends of the Jewish people, then they acknowledge and they understand and they ask questions. They're like, why do you do this? Why do you wear this? Why is this? What's this all about? Why do you do what you do on this day? What's this? What's this representing? All of these things. My point is to get you to understand that just because somebody touched the hem doesn't mean that solidifies that they are a Jew, but it also doesn't mean that they aren't a Jew. And so, it's on each one of us to really dive in and to study these types of things. But it's very interesting that this hem, they touched the hem of his garment. It says in verse 36, and begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment, and as many as touched it were made perfectly well. It's so interesting to see this kind of stuff. We talked a lot about the hem of the garment, so we won't go down that route again. Okay, but now what we're going to do here, and this is why I hope you were kind of at least paying attention. Let's do a little bit of a summary to chapter 14, and let's unpack some things. Because I'm gonna paint a little picture again, and I'm not saying that this is right, but I'm going to say words, and I'm just going to ask you what you think, and you guys can agree or disagree. I was actually thinking about making a little TikTok video about this. Who knows? Maybe I will, but I think it's very provocative at the very least to at least consider it. So here in chapter 14, let's do a little summary of chapter 14. So what do you have going on in chapter 14? Well, in chapter 14, you have Herod. Now, what is going on with Herod? Yeah, cool. Herod, you have Herod. He is the ruler of this region, right? So you have Herod. It kicks off with Herod. Herod is the ruler of this region, or the ruler of the age. He is living in open adultery. He's living in open adultery. And we know, let's go to James chapter 4. James chapter 4, verse 4. So Herod, he's the ruler of the age, living in adultery. In James chapter 4, verse 4, it says this. James chapter 4, verse 4, it says, adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. So Herod was a professed Jew, but not really. He was just trying to make it, play nice with the people that he was around, just so that they wouldn't rebel. But you have Herod, who's the ruler of that region. He is living in open adultery, as James 4:4 says. Then he kills a prophet at the request of a woman. And I think that's very interesting. So Herod, the ruler, kills a prophet at the request of a woman. What does that remind us of? Let's go to Revelation chapter 18. Revelation chapter 18, verse 24. In Revelation chapter 18, verse 24, it says, and in her, speaking of the harlot, and in her was found the blood of prophets and saints and of all who were slain on the earth. This is Babylon, speaking of Babylon. Mystery Babylon, the harlot. So he kills a prophet at the request of Herodias, or a woman. Then, what you have after all of that, then the people are fed in a wilderness with a remnant of 12 baskets. Well, that's interesting. They're fed, the people, which are it's the majority. I would say I'm not going to say all of them, but the majority of them in this wilderness at this time are Jewish people, and they have a remnant of 12 baskets. Now, what does that make you think of? Go to Revelation chapter 7, because in Revelation chapter 7 you have a remnant of. In Revelation chapter 7, you have the 12 tribes. There's 12,000 from each 12 tribes, which 12,000 times 12 equals 144,000. So you have a remnant of 144,000. But you have the 12 tribes. You have the 12 baskets. which is, makes you think of Revelation chapter 7 because of the 12,000, 12,000, 12,000, 12,000. But then after the remnant of the 12 baskets, then Jesus deliberately sets them in a boat. What do I mean by that? Go to Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. In Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, it says this: immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. Now that's interesting. So Jesus deliberately puts them in a boat in the middle of a sea. So they're in the boat in the middle of a sea, but what does the sea represent? What is the sea a type of? Now the sea is a type of Gentiles, and I think that's very interesting. How is the sea a type of Gentiles? Let's go to Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 3. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 3, or verse 1. Daniel chapter 7, verse 1. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 1, it says, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head while on his bed. Then he wrote down the dream, telling the main facts. Daniel spoke, saying, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. So here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 3, this sea, you have this Gentile nations or these Gentile beasts coming out of the sea. So the sea is Gentile. It speaks of this of the Gentile nations. And so also, if you go to Revelation chapter 13, verse 1, it talks about how this beast comes out of the sea, which is why many people, the scholars are divided on this, so you can choose to land where you would like to land. But in Revelation chapter 13, it says that the beast comes out of the sea. Some people think that there's, first off, in Revelation 13, there are two beasts. There's the beast and the false prophet. So there's a duality going on there. So some people think that one will be a Gentile and one will be a Jew because of the whole typology that's going on here. And it's not a big deal, a reason to divide over. Some people are like, no, he's got to be a Jew. No, he's got to be a Gentile. There's people who like, like, we'll find, I believe we'll be gone before the Antichrist is revealed. So anyways, but you have this sea, which is a type of the Gentile nations. So while they're in a boat, going back to this whole picture, while they are in a boat, what is Jesus doing? Jesus is praying. Jesus is praying where? Where is Jesus? What is Jesus praying on? We're told that he goes on a mountain and he prays. And I think that's very interesting. Why are we told why doesn't the Bible just say he went alone and he prayed? Why doesn't it say that? Why does it specifically tell us that he went on a mountain and prayed? Now, what is a mountain representative of? A mountain, let's go to Daniel chapter 2. A mountain is representing a kingdom or a government. In Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 2, verse 45. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 45, it says this. In Daniel chapter 2, verse 45, it says this. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. This mountain is going to replace all of these empires of the world. You have Babylon rises up and it comes into power, and then it falls, and then the Medo-Persian Empire takes over, and then they rise up, and then it falls, and then the Greek Empire rises up and it falls, and then the Roman Empire rises up and it never gets defeated. It just kind of breaks apart. And so it's very interesting, but you have this mountain, Daniel chapter 2, verse 45, and other places that talk about the government or a government. So Jesus is on a mountain. He's praying. We don't know what he's specifically praying for. You could assume, you could infer that he's praying for the disciples, which is a very real possibility. In John chapter 17, we learn that Jesus does not pray for the world, but he prays for his own people. And so that's who he's praying for. He's praying for his people. Fascinating. But What's, oh, let me find it. I think it's Matthew 18. Okay. So then with all that in mind, what after that, then you have Peter is called out of the boat. Peter's called out of the boat. Peter's called out of the boat. I mean, he had a 1 in 12 chance. Like, it could have been any of the other ones. But why was it Peter? I think it's so interesting. Go to Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. Matthew chapter 16, verse 18. And in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, it says, "And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." Now, what's interesting about this is that, is Peter in this painting? I just poked myself in the eye. Help! But in this picture that we're talking about right now, is Peter a type of the church? He's called out. He is pulled out. He's pulled out of that boat. I don't know. I don't know. I just think it's very interesting. You see all of this whole type of situation. It is so unbelievable. So just to kind of fly by it quicker than what we just, we were just explaining everything, just the whole chapter 14. You have Herod, who is representing the ruler of this age. He's living in open adultery, which is emblematic of everything going on in Revelation chapter 17 and 18, and then he kills a prophet at the request of a woman. And then after that, there are people fed in the wilderness, and there is a remnant of 12 baskets. Those 12, there's always going to be a remnant. And so it's so fascinating to see that. And then after that, Jesus deliberately sets them in a boat, and he puts them in the middle of the sea. And then after they're in the middle of the sea represents the Gentile nations. And so they're on the boat, and Jesus is praying on a mountain. It's so interesting. And then after he's praying on the mountain, then Peter comes out of the boat. I don't know. I just think you got a lot of stuff going on here. I don't know exactly how to think, but there's something here. And I think it's kind of cool to see, and I don't know, but I'm just putting it out there. Take it how you will. I think it's fascinating. Okay, that is Matthew chapter 14. Matthew chapter 14. Let's go ahead and read. Now we're going to dive into, I'm sorry I missed the part, where is the sea of the Gentiles? Daniel chapter 7, verse 1 through 3 is where you kind of get that idea. Because in Daniel chapter 7, you have the beasts. Daniel sees the four beasts, the first empire, the second empire, the third empire, the fourth empire, or the kingdoms, whatever you want to refer to it. And they're all Gentile. They're all Gentile beasts. They're every single one of them. And when you couple that with Luke 21:24, where it talks about, Jesus says, until the times of the Gentiles, we are still in the times of the Gentiles right now. And so all of these empires are, rising up. So the sea is a picture of the Gentile. So that's how some people see it. So do your own research, obviously. Dive into it. See where you land. Very fascinating one way or the other. All right, so let's go ahead and get on. So that's Matthew chapter 14. Hopefully that answers your question, Julie. Yeah, absolutely. If you guys are new here, thank you so much for being here. My name is Ryan. We are just diving through the Bible, verse by verse, book by book, and we are going through the book of Matthew right now. All of these studies are uploaded to YouTube. There's a YouTube up here if you're interested. There's a YouTube link up here. If you wanted to go subscribe over there, I would appreciate it. Just trying to get up to 1,000 just in case they get rid of TikTok. For whatever reason, or if I get banned again. But all of these studies are uploaded to YouTube if you are interested for looking for a verse-by-verse Bible study. This is a decent one. Hey, thank you, Mark. Yep, that's it right here. ITZ_sheesh if you're looking for it. Okay, so that's Matthew chapter 14. We're going to dive into Matthew chapter 15 now. And just obviously the most important thing, and I say this all the time, but I'm just going to keep on doing it. The primary issue is how to know for sure you can get to heaven. That's the most important thing. If you don't know how to know for sure to get to heaven, then you don't know anything. All of this stuff, like there's so many people who are smart out there who know more about the Bible than I ever will, who are completely lost. And I'm blown away by that idea. Like, man, how can you know so much and still be so lost? But there's only one way to get to heaven, and you need to first acknowledge that you're a sinner. And when you acknowledge that you're a sinner, then you start looking for a savior. And then when you start looking for a savior, you find Jesus, and Jesus is the Son of God. He led a sinless life. He died on the cross for your sins. He was the substitutionary sacrifice. Should have been you, should have been me, but he took my place. It should have been Barabbas, but he took my place. He took his place. He set me free. He took my place. So Jesus died on the cross for your sins. He was buried, and then he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. That's 1 Corinthians 15:3-4. It says that Jesus died according to the scriptures. He was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. And then we need to understand that for by grace are you saved through faith. You are saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Okay. Let's dive into Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15, we're going to be talking about, I actually like the way that my Bible titles this first part of Matthew chapter 15. My Bible titles this chapter as God's commandments versus man's traditions. So we are going to be talking about God's commandments versus man's tradition. I think that's very fitting, at least for the first 20 or so verses. So let's dive on into Matthew chapter 15 with that in mind. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 1, it says, Then the scribes and Pharisees who were from Jerusalem came to Jesus, saying, Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. Okay. I think in verse 2, you should underline the word tradition. Because that's a very important word to really zoom in on. Tradition means nothing. Tradition is zero. It means absolutely nothing. Tradition, like, okay, if anybody's in here watched The Fiddler on the Roof, it gives you a good Jewish perspective, but there's a guy that, like, I forget his name, but he sings in there, he's like, it's tradition, and, like, it's a whole musical, and I totally nailed that, by the way. Just don't watch it, because then you'd be able to see how it's supposed to sound, but Matthew chapter, you just watched it, did you really? That's hilarious. Matthew chapter 15, verse 2, it says that these Pharisees, again, they're testing Jesus, and they say, Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread. He answered and said to them, Why do you also transgress the commandment of God because of your tradition? I would underline the word your tradition, the phrase your tradition in verse 3, because you're seeing what the focus is on here, because it's your tradition. Their tradition versus written commands. Their tradition versus written commands. And so in verse 1 through 3, in Pharisaical Judaism, their oral law, it's good to understand and remember, their oral law was above God's written law. Their oral law was above God's written law. And that is how they thought. And so they come in with all these accusatory, they start accusing about them not washing their hands because of tradition. It's tradition to do this. So this is the waters that we are wading into right now. Matthew chapter 15, verse 4. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 4, Jesus continues and says, For God commanded, saying, Honor your father and your mother, and he who curses father or mother, let him be put to death. But you say, Whoever says to his father or mother, Whatever profit you might have received from me is a gift to God, then he need not honor his father or mother. Thus you have made the commandment of God of no effect by your tradition. Hypocrites! So we'll stop right there. So you're getting the feel for the entire situation. Jesus is not happy. He's being called out because of tradition. And then he's calling them out because of what is written down. There's a stark difference between tradition and what man, sinners, made up compared to the word of God, which was written down. And so verse 4 and 5, what this is actually talking about here in verse 4, 5, and verse 6, verse 4, 5, and 6, the Pharisees manipulated the law in a way to basically evade the command to honor or to take care of their parents. You know, like one of the 10 commandments, honor your mother and your father, right? Like that had more than just respecting your parents, right? There's more than just respecting your parents. Honoring them is also to take care of your parents. And so they manipulated the law as a way to evade the command to honor or to take care of their parents. So this twisting of the law turned into their tradition, which bypassed God's command. So they were manipulating it so that they didn't have to actually take care. Thank you, child of God. Thank you. So that they were trying to bypass all of these things, bypass taking care of their parents, which bypassed God's command. So they were obeying their traditions, which words in effect essentially ignored God's command. And so that's why in verse 7, is Jesus, after he explains that entire thing, he says, hypocrites. That's fascinating. That's some harsh language. Can you imagine going up to somebody right now and calling them a hypocrite? Like, even if you try to be nice and be like, oh, man, you're such a hypocrite. Like, that still kind of stings. Like, even, like, how do you do that, like, in, like, the nicest way possible? Do you, like, laugh hysterically and just be like, oh, you're a hypocrite? Like, you know, like, no, it doesn't work that way. This is a very sharp word, and he's using it very appropriately. He says, hypocrites. Well, did Isaiah prophesy about you, saying, these people draw near to me with their mouth and honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. Sheesh! Like, that is crazy. So again, he's quoting Isaiah. Let's go to Isaiah 29:13. Isaiah 29, verse 13. This is what he's quoting here. In Isaiah chapter 29, verse 13, it says this, therefore the Lord said, inasmuch as these people draw near with their mouths and honor me with their lips, but have removed their hearts far from me, and their fear toward me is taught by the commandment of men. This is fake worship. This is fake worship. Let's talk. So he's quoting Isaiah, but it's fake worship. You know, it's absolutely terrifying. It is absolutely terrifying. And so, you know, we will know them by their fruits, right? You're going to know them by their fruits. But fake worship, and it makes you think all over again. In Matthew chapter 7, when Jesus says to his disciples, and the multitude is all listening, he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord. And he goes on and he's like, everybody's going to say, did we not prophesy? Did we not speak in tongues? Did we not do all of these signs and wonders? Did we not cast out demons? Did we not do all of these things in your name? And he will say, depart from me. These people that Jesus is contending with right now are what you and I would classify as the most religious people in the world. And this is a stark realization to really get it to sink into your brain that being religious is terrifying for people. And this is what you're seeing here. So in Matthew chapter 15, verse 8, it says, these people draw near to me with their mouth, and they honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. The heart of the matter is always a matter of the heart. Verse 9, it says, Matthew 15, verse 9, it says, and in vain they worship me. In vain. You need to understand, the question is it possible to worship in vain? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Verse 9, in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. This is so terrifying. Man, worshiping in vain. You know, a lot of people love Christian music, You know, a lot of people put their hands up in the air while they're driving, and they're like just screaming, and they're just like, they get the tingles, and they just feel all kinds of good, and they're just like, oh man, hallelujah, right? And that is just, it's just absolutely tragic. It is absolutely tragic to see this kind of stuff. In vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. So he's clearly contrasting their traditions to his written word. Now that is crazy. But verse 9, let's go to Colossians chapter 2, verse 22. Colossians chapter 2, verse 22. Because this is Paul quotes this in Colossians chapter 2, verse 22, or he mentions it in Colossians chapter 2, verse 22, where Paul's combating the Gnosticism, and the mysticism, and that's running rampant in the religious world. But in Colossians chapter 2, verse 22, Paul says in verse 21, he says, "Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle," verse 22, "which all concern things which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men." Interesting. Commandments and doctrines of men. That's terrifying. You know, a lot of people like trying to do the right thing. A lot of people buy into to what the people are selling, as far as like, you just got to be a good person and do this and do this and do this. And Jesus is bringing that to the forefront of our minds here in verse 9, Matthew chapter 15, verse 9, and he says, "And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men." You know what's interesting about the whole concept with Jesus contending with the Pharisees is that the Pharisees, or the Jewish people, they grew further and further and further away because of man's doctrine. So how did it start? It started with the Mosaic Law. The Mosaic Law was good. This is good. The Mosaic Law is good. This is, Moses, the 10 Commandments, the 613 laws, whatever. That's God's law. Then, on God's law, this is the foundation. This is where they needed to stay. But they added to it, and they started building on top of it. And then they get all the way up here, which is called the Pharisaical law. And so that is where Jesus is contending with, the Pharisaical law. And then they built on top of the Pharisaical law, and then they got all the way up here to the Talmudic law. And so then after they got all the way to the Talmudic law, they kept on building, and they kept on building. They got to the Kabbalah, which deals with all kinds of mysticism and all kinds of rituals and crap. And then they kept on building on top of that. They kept on building on top of that. And then they got to the Hasidic Judaism. And then you just see how far away they are from the foundation, which is the law. And so Jesus is like, what are you doing way up there? You got to come all the way back down here. And so this is how the further, like, you're seeing the trend, they're trending away from God, further and further away, getting more vested in the traditions of men and the commandments of men and the doctrines of men, and they're not focusing on the commandment of God. All right, so let's go to verse 10. Matthew chapter 15, verse 10. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 10, it says, "When he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them, 'Hear and understand.'" Now, here, so get the picture. So here in verse 10, it says, when he had called the multitude to himself, he said to them. So in verse 1 through 9, he was talking to the Pharisees. He was talking to the Pharisees. But now here in verse 10, now he's talking to the people. He addresses the Pharisees. He calls them out. He calls them hypocrites. Hypocrites? Blood's in the... no, but the hypocrites, he calls them hypocrites. And then now here in verse 10, he is going to be readjusting and talking to the people. And so he says to the people, he says, "Hear and understand. Not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man." So he's trying to undo a lot of the Pharisaical teaching. Because you got to understand, like the Pharisees in their culture were the people, like if they had a question, they would go to the Pharisee. They'd be like, hey, tell us what this means. And the Pharisees would be like, oh, according to this rabbi, this is what this means. And this rabbi said this, and we really like what this rabbi said, and this rabbi said this. And so they got very rabbi-y, and that is not the way that it was meant to be. They should have stuck to the law instead of actually sticking to man's law. So that's what he's basically expounding on here in verse 11. He says, not what goes into the mouth defiles a man, but what comes out of the mouth, this defiles a man. Then his disciples came and said to him, do you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? I think that's hilarious. They're asking Jesus the question, did you know, Jesus? Did you know this? Like, after all they've been through, they go up and they ask him if he was aware. Oh man, I'm sure he was just completely taken back by learning something. I'm totally kidding there. But verse 13, moving on, Matthew chapter 15, verse 13, it says, but he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Now it's fascinating because here, if you go back, he's talking about plants. Now this kind of seems to go back to Matthew chapter 13. If we go back to Matthew chapter 13, verse 24, Matthew chapter 13, verse 24, this goes back to the parables that Jesus was talking about. And so in Matthew chapter 13, verse 24, it says, another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. Now this good seed is representative in this context to be Christian people. I am planted out here in this field. You, if you're a born-again believer, you have been planted out here as well. But there are other plants. Now, earlier on in the chapter, the good seed represents the gospel. That's the word of God. That was what the seed was in the first half of the chapter. But here in verse 24, you and I are this good seed. But here in Matthew 13, verse 24 says, another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares? He said to them, an enemy has done this. So what you see here is that there's a distinction between the seed that is being sown in the world. There's the good seed, you and I, if you're a born-again believer in this context, mixed in with the fake stuff. And they grow, and we talked about the seed that's over in Palestine where this seed looks like wheat while it's growing. But when it matures, it turns black, and if it's mixed with the wheat when you're trying to make bread, it becomes poisonous. It becomes toxic. But there's a difference in the seed. It's very close, very close. It kind of looks very similar. But it's fascinating to see. And so when they grow together, then it's very apparent which is which. And so, there's two different kinds of seed that's being grown here, which results in two different kinds of plants. And so when you go back to Matthew chapter 15, verse 13, Matthew chapter 15, verse 13, where it says, but he answered and said, every plant which my heavenly Father has not planted, which will be uprooted. If he didn't plant you, you're going to be uprooted. And so it's just so interesting. Like if you are born again, he knows who you are. If you are not, he knows that you're going to be uprooted. Seems to be the idea of what's going on here. But let's go back to Matthew chapter 15, verse 14. Moving on. Matthew chapter 15, verse 14, it says, let them alone. Let them alone. Talking about the Pharisees. He's talking to his disciples here in verse 14, and he tells his disciples to let the Pharisees alone. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into a ditch. Now, this ditch can be translated pit as well, which I think is very interesting because, I don't know if this is like an allusion to the Abuso or anything like that. I'm not really sure. Could be, could possibly be. I just thought it was interesting that it's also translated pit or ditch, one way or the other. But moving on to verse 15, in Matthew chapter 15, verse 15, it says, then Peter answered and said to him, explain this parable to us. Verse 16, so Jesus said, are you also still without understanding? Do you not understand that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and is eliminated? But those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart produces evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So what's interesting about this situation is that Jesus goes up to Peter, or Peter comes up to Jesus rather, and he's like, "Can you explain this to us, Jesus?" And Jesus is like, "Were you not there at the Sermon on the Mount? If you were there, if you guys remember the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew, let's go back to, I think, Matthew chapter 5. Yeah, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. Go to Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, now remember, in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is painting a very vivid picture. He's telling them that it's not what you do physically, it's what happens before that. It's what happens before you do something physically. If you're going to go cheat on your wife or on your husband, it doesn't just, you know, you're just walking through the store and you're just like thinking of all kinds of other things, and you have no desire to cheat on your spouse, and then all of a sudden you're just like over there like making out with somebody. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. That's not how it happens. It starts internally, the heart. And so that's what he's trying to get your eyes to your mind to understand. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 27, he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. Verse 28, he says, but I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. His heart. It's so interesting that it's I've said it a million times, but that's what he's trying to. The heart of the matter is always a matter of the heart. And so what you read in verse 29, it says, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. And then it talks about if your arm or if your hand causes you to sin, cut that off, and all this kind of stuff. It's not it. That's not the point. The point is you need to treat the cause. The cause is the heart. You need a heart transplant. You got to get that heart, because out of that heart is where everything is being grown out of. This is the seed here. Which side is my heart on? Over here. This is the seed, and out of all of this is where everything is stemming from. And that's what the whole idea. He's like, it's not your arm, it's not your eye. That's just like a symptom. You're treating the symptoms. You're not treating the cause. You got to stop you got to treat the root of everything, and that is where your heart comes into play. So out of your heart is where everything is growing from. So all the actions are a byproduct of the heart, and that is what he's basically talking about here. So in Matthew chapter 15, going back to Matthew chapter 15, verse 19, in Matthew chapter 15, verse 18, Matthew chapter 15, verse 18, it says, but those things which proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and they defile a man. For out of the heart proceed evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, blasphemies. These are the things which are defile a man. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile a man. So he's telling them in verse 20, where it says, but to eat with unwashed hands, that is the man tradition. That is the man-made tradition. That is man's tradition. And so he's saying man's tradition is not what defiles a man. It is the things that he just mentioned in verse 18 and 19. Okay, so let's move on. Matthew chapter 15. Matthew chapter 15, verse 21. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 21, it says this, then Jesus went out from there and departed to the region of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a woman of Canaan came from that region and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon-possessed. Okay, so here we are going to see that this woman is most likely, and I'm saying there's a high probability that this is a Gentile woman. She's in the region of Tyre and Sidon, which is more predominantly Gentile. Gentilian. Is that a word? Gentilian? Reptilian? Gentilian. She's a Gentilian. She's a Gentile, but it says, she says, O Lord, Son of David. So it's interesting because you have this probable Gentile woman who is addressing Jesus as the Son of David, which I think is very interesting, because she's acknowledging that he's the Messiah. She knows who he is, and she's acknowledging him by his messianic title. She doesn't say Son of God. She doesn't say Son of Man. She says Son of David. And so you have this Gentile woman referring to him as through his messianic title. And I think it's very interesting. But she says, "Oh Lord, have mercy, Son of David. My daughter is severely demon possessed." Verse 23, it gets a little interesting here. In verse 23, it says, "But he answered her not a word." That's some cold stuff right there. It's like, oh, it's interesting that he didn't answer her a word. Seems kind of heartless, right? But it says in verse 23, "But he answered her not a word. And his disciples came and urged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she cries out after us.'" So she's basically a stage 5 clinger, if you know what I mean. No, I'm totally kidding. But she's following them. She's crying out, and she's being very persistent, and she's doing it enough for his disciples to come up to Jesus and say, "Can you please send her away? She is crying out after us." So this is a very interesting scenario if you can imagine it. And so here we get to verse 24. In verse 24 it says this, "But he, Jesus, answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Now, okay, so here, Jesus basically tells us why, and basically confirms the whole idea that this is a Gentile woman. Because if this was a Jewish woman, then he would not have said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Because the lost sheep of the house of Israel is the Jewish people. So if this woman was a Jew, then he would have helped her, because it would have been like, yes, you are part of my ministry. You are a Jewish person. I am here for you specifically. I'm going to help you. But this woman was a Gentile. And so he answers her by reminding everybody what his whole priority was. His whole ministry was to the Jewish people. Now, the apostles, as we know from Acts chapter 1, verse 8, that they're going to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth, which is where you and I get grafted in because we're in that verse. But here it says, but he answered in verse 24, in Matthew chapter 15, verse 24, it says, "But he answered and said, I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." So then we get to verse 25. In verse 25, it says this, "Then she came and worshipped him, saying, Lord, help me." So what she does in verse 22, she refers to him as Son of David. She says, "O Lord, Son of David." But in verse 25, she removes the title of Son of David, and she just calls him Lord. So I think that's very interesting. So she changes how she addressed him to Lord. And so what's interesting here when we go to verse 26 is that it says, "But he answered and said, It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." And she said, "Yes, Lord. Yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Hey, thank you, Renewed Soul. Thank you. Then Jesus answered and said to her, "O woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire." And her daughter was healed from that very hour. Thank you, Renewed Soul. I think this is very interesting. What in the world is going on here? Did Jesus call this lady a dog? Well, that's what our English word says, but it's fascinating. And this is one of those reasons, perfect examples on why it's good to dive into the Greek. But in verse 26, it says, "But he answered and said, It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." These little dogs, you could just look at it as puppies. A dog is a more derogatory kind of flavor to the entire thing. But here, these are little puppies. And so, why in the world, in verse 27, it says, "Yes, Lord," she says, "Yes, Lord, yet even the little puppies eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So what is going on here? Because whatever she said meant something to Jesus, because in verse 28, Jesus says, "Oh woman, great is your faith." And then her daughter was healed. So whatever she said made sense between the two of them, and they're speaking in code to you and I as far as our Gentile minds. But what's going on here? So let's go back to verse 24. In verse 24, just to kind of categorize some things for us, so for our understanding, in verse 24, Jesus tells us that he was not sent except to the lost sheep of Israel. The sheep, in this context, is referring to the Jews. The Jews equal sheep. Jews, sheep. Okay? That is what the Jews are the sheep. Then in verse 26, the little dogs, or the puppies, the puppies are the Gentiles. So that is outside his ministry. He wasn't sent to us. He wasn't sent to you if you're a Gentile. He wasn't sent to me. He was sent to the sheep, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And so he's prioritizing. He's letting everybody know. The disciples go up into him. They're like, "Hey, Jesus, can you get rid of this person?" And he's like, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep house, the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she continues on bothering them. She's being very persistent. So you have the sheep representing Israel. You have the puppies representing the Gentiles. And she's being very, very persistent. And so let's dive into this persistency. Let's go to Luke chapter 18, verse 1. Luke chapter 18, verse 1. Luke chapter 18, verse 1 is it's a really good reminder for you and for I on what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to be. Luke chapter 18, verse 1. In Luke chapter 18, verse 1, it says this: "Then he spoke a parable to them," Jesus spoke a parable to them, "that men always ought to pray and not lose heart." Now there's a verse for you right there. You, if you're born again, you always ought to pray and not lose heart. That's one of those where you're just like, okay, that's really easy. No, it's not. Lose heart? You kidding me? I did that like 5 times today. Let's go to verse 2. In verse 2 it says, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. So this is a bad judge. This is not a good guy, but he's a judge nonetheless. Verse 3, it says, "Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, 'Get justice for me from my adversary.' And he would not. The judge would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, 'Though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me.' Then the Lord said, 'Hear what the unjust judge said. And shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?'" What you see here is this whole picture, what we just read in Luke 18, is this judge in this story was not a good guy, but he was still a judge. And this woman had something done terrible to her, and she goes to the judge, and she's like, "Are you going to avenge me?" And the judge is like, "Not right now." Then the next day, she comes back. "You going to avenge me?" "Not right now." She comes back the next day. "You going to avenge me?" "Not right now." "You going to come back?" You coming back tomorrow, right?" "Yeah, okay, well, talk to me tomorrow." And she comes back tomorrow. "You going to avenge me?" "Not today." And so this judge is like, "I'm picking up on a pattern here." And so this lady is being very persistent. Being very, very persistent. And this makes us, let's go to Isaiah chapter 62. Let's go to Isaiah chapter 62. Because if you were here for our study of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah chapter 62 verse 6, Isaiah chapter 62 verse 6, we're told again to be persistent in our prayers. In Isaiah chapter 62 verse 6, it says this: "I have set watchmen on your walls, O Jerusalem. They shall never hold their peace day or night. You who make mention of the Lord, do not keep silent, and give God no rest till he establishes, until he makes Jerusalem a praise in the earth." Did you know that you and I, we are not, we are told to not let him rest. We are told to bug the crap out of him. We are supposed to just keep him up at night and be like, God, help. Right? And so anyways, going back to Matthew chapter 15, with this whole idea of being persistent in our prayers, this lady in Matthew chapter 15 is demonstrating. This woman in Matthew chapter 15, verse verse 21 through 28, this woman is demonstrating that she understood that what Jesus's priority was. She understands what Jesus's priority was. She's like, I understand that your ministry is to the lost sheep of Israel. Okay, so she's demonstrating that she knows that by saying in verse 27, yes, Lord, yet even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table. So what she is saying is that she's acknowledging that his ministry was to the lost sheep of Israel, which is to the Jewish people. She's like, yes, I acknowledge that your ministry is to the Jewish people, but she, knowing who he was, recognized that he had the ability, and she saw beyond his apparent limitations to just Israel, and she asked again. She's like, Lord, I know you are here for them, but I also understand that you can do this for me. And so that is essentially what she's saying. And so in verse 28, that's why it says, then Jesus answered and said to her, oh, woman, great is your faith. Let it be to you as you desire. And that is what's going on in that passage. So that is very cool. I think it's very cool. It really shows a lot. Let's move on to verse 29. Matthew chapter 15, verse 29. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 29, it says this, Jesus departed from there, skirted the Sea of Galilee, and went up on the mountain and sat down there. Then great multitudes came to him, having with them the lame, blind, mute, maimed, and many others. And they laid them down at Jesus' feet, and he healed them. This is like one of those passages where you're just like, okay, we literally got a screenshot. We have no idea of the lives changed in a moment here. Like, can you imagine? It just says he healed them, just like casually, 3 words. He healed them. Man, we have no idea. It's unbelievable. Verse 31, it says, so the multitude marveled when they saw the mute speaking, the maimed made whole, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. I think it's very instructive what their knee-jerk reaction was. Their knee-jerk reaction was to glorify God. And I think that's interesting. When you hear of things happening, like good things, there's still good things, a lot of good things happening in the world today. They're just not, they just don't make the TV or the news, because every time, a car somebody crosses the road safely, you don't hear about that. You only hear about when somebody gets hit by a car. So there's a lot of things that are still happening that are good in the world. But here, these people saw what Jesus did, and they glorified God. What does that remind you of? Let's go to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, in the Sermon on the Mount. Have a good night, Respiratory. Matthew chapter 5, verse 16. It reminds us what we're supposed to be doing. And this is exactly what Jesus was doing. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 16, it says this, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Interesting. That's exactly what they were doing here in Matthew 15, verse 31. Okay, so let's go to, what up, Henry? How you doing, man? Ooh, new profile picture. Weird. I don't like it. Change it back. I'm just kidding. But seriously. Matthew chapter 15, verse 32. In Matthew chapter 15, verse 32, it says, now Jesus called his disciples to himself and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they have now continued with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. Then his disciples said to him, where could we get enough bread in the wilderness to fill such a great multitude? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7. and a few little fish. So he commanded the multitude to sit down on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and broke the fish and gave thanks. He broke them and gave them to his disciples, and the disciples gave to the multitude. So you see the pattern there. Jesus broke them, he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the multitude. Same pattern that took place in the last chapter, same order of operations. Jesus had it, he gave it to his disciples took it, his disciples handed it out. Matthew chapter 15, verse 37, it says, so they all ate and were filled, and they took up 7 large baskets full of the fragments that were left. Now, I think that's very interesting. So you have 7 loaves and you have 7 large baskets full of fragments that were left. Hey, thank you, Jules. It says in verse 38, it says, now those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. So 4,000, there's probably around 10,000 people here. The other one was about 10 to 15,000 probably. But in verse 39, it says, and he sent away the multitude, got into the boat, and came to the region of Magdala. Now, okay, so there should be, like, it's very interesting. I think it's interesting because we're told in the last chapter that Jesus fed 5,000. Okay, and so here in this chapter we're told that he fed 4,000. So there's 5,000, then there's 4,000. So the question is, why are we told about this? Like, we were already told about the 5,000. Why are we told about the 4,000? Like, what's the whole point? Like, why take up this extra space here just to tell us a little bit about the 4,000? We already read about the 5,000. Why do we need to know about this? And so that's like a natural thing to consider, right? But let's compare the two. Let's compare the feeding of the 5,000 to the feeding of the 4,000. Okay, so there's some distinctions that are going on here, but the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew 14, the 5,000, what we can, this is you can do your own research here, but based upon the location, the feeding of the 5,000 seems to show that it was mostly Jewish people. The majority was predominantly Jewish in the feeding of the 5,000. Also at the feeding of the 5,000, it took place in Galilee, which, enforces the idea of the majority being Jewish. There was also, in the feeding of the 5,000, there were 5 loaves and 2 fish. There were 12 baskets left over. Those 12 baskets are very idiomatic for, or they're very representative of the Jewish people. Okay, and it also seems there's some people, and this is just what some people have concluded, and you can do your own research on it. But just the wording of it, the idea of what the picture that's being painted here, the time, like the season, like the time in the calendar month, people infer that this was during the spring season. And they find that just based upon words, and they're putting words together, and they're like, oh, they wouldn't be out in the wilderness during this time, nobody would be out there, so we can rule that one out. And they draw some connections. And so there's people who like to dive into this kind of stuff who infer that this is during the spring time. And so you're like, well, what's the whole point of, like, who cares what time of month it was or whatever, or what time of the year it was? And it's just to kind of paint you a picture, just to draw more on the Jewishness of it all, because the spring feasts, the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and the Feast of First Fruits are all Jewishy. They're very Jewishy. Now, in contrast to the feeding of the 4,000, you have, it's in a different location. It was in Decapolis, and so Decapolis is more so predominantly Gentile-y, and it was predominantly Gentiles. There was 7 loaves and a few fish. Now you have seven loaves. So that's interesting. One has 5 loaves and 2 fish. This has 7 loaves and a few fish. So we're getting a picture being painted here. But then we're also told here in the feeding of the 4,000 that there were 7 baskets left over, compared to the other one where there was 12 baskets left over. Now that's interesting because the 7 seems to be representative of the church, in some aspects. I'm not saying in all aspects. I'm not saying anything very dogmatically. I'm just saying that there's reasons for all of these things, and I'm just trying to paint some kind of a picture here. But what's interesting about this is that in the feeding of the 5,000, we are told very clearly that there was 5 loaves. Okay, so with the feeding of the 5,000, where it's predominantly Jewish, because there was the 12 baskets left over, you have the 5 loaves. Now we're just keying in on here on the loaves, the bread. So you have 5 loaves, and what is 5 when you're thinking of 5 and you're thinking of Jewish? What kind of pops out when you're thinking of the number 5? What comes to mind when you're thinking of 5 in a Jewish mind when it comes to the Bible? So okay, grace, yeah, but you also, again, another thing on top of that is you have the Torah. So you have, obviously Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. You have the Torah, and so with that in mind, that is when it comes to connecting to bread, you have 5 pieces of bread. They have 5 books of Moses. That is their bread. That is the Jewish people's bread. Now, in contrast to the feeding of the 4,000, which is predominantly Gentile, we are told that there are 7 loaves of bread. Now, that's very interesting. You have 7 loaves of bread. And 7, with the 7 candlesticks, the candlesticks representing possibly the 7 churches that are found in Revelation chapter 2 and 3, with the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Even Paul's letters, he wrote letters to 7 churches. If you take out 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and he wrote, it seems like you can see the structure of it all to be picture of the church. And so I think that's something to pay attention to. But one way or the another, the feeding of the 5,000, they have 5 loaves to the Jewish people, so they're being fed in those 5 books. Then you have the 7 loaves to the 4,000, which represent the Jewish people, 7 to the churches. But one way or the other, no matter how you look at it, you have the Jewish people being represented, and you have the Gentile people being represented. And one way or the other, they are both being fed. And I think that's very interesting to see how they're both being fed. They're being fulfilled. They're being provided for. And so if we go to John chapter 6 verse 35, in John chapter 6 verse 35, we've talked about this before, but there are 7 I am statements in the Gospel of John. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the door. I am here in John chapter 6 verse 35, it says, and Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. And so he's just providing. There's probably a lot more to it. I'm not trying to get too crazy with it. I'm just drawing some kind of connections to it in some kind of fashion. But we're told very specifically about the 5,000, which is very Jewish. We're told about the 4,000, which is very Gentile. And then there's all kinds of, you can just go all over the place with this kind of stuff. But yep. All right. So that's what I got for you guys. That is Matthew chapter 14 and Matthew chapter 15. This one was not that long of a one, so that's probably because I didn't do that long of a review, which is fine. These recaps, they can get pretty long sometimes, but that is, Matthew chapter 14 and chapter 15. As per usual, if you guys are new here, we are just doing a Bible study. We're going through the Bible book by book, verse by verse, chapter by chapter. All of these are uploaded to YouTube. There's a YouTube link up here. If you wanted to go subscribe over there, I would appreciate it. That would encourage me, if you did. And if not, no biggie. It's not a big deal. I'm never going to be like, tap the screen. I'm not one of those dudes. I'm just thinking that if I get banned on here, or if TikTok gets banned in general, then we would at least have another platform to continue this on. if that is the plan. So that is there. All of the other studies that we've done, Revelation, Daniel, Ruth, all the other Pauline epistles, Isaiah, Zechariah, they're all up there too. If you're interested in going to check that out, you're more than welcome to. We talk about a lot of things. If you're new here and you haven't watched any of those videos, just know that we always talk about like the world in a sense for the first 20 minutes or so. We talk about current events because we're very mindful of the things going on here around Israel. And and then we get into the recap. And so we always do a recap before whatever chapter we're diving into. So for tonight we did chapter 14. And so we did a review of chapters 1 through 13 before we dove into chapter 14, just to kind of bring things to mind in case you missed anything. And if you didn't miss anything, then maybe I could word it a different way and it would make sense for the next one. But yeah, absolutely, Lisa. Cool. And glad it was awesome. Great study tonight. Thanks, DJ Nick. Yeah, it's an early one. I'm so glad I was here for this study. It was fascinating. Yeah, absolutely. Sunday. Dina, for sure. Glad you guys could be here for this. I know it's an early one. Crazy, right? Y'all get released so much earlier than normal. What is that about? Yeah, absolutely. KT. Yeah, Henry. Absolutely. Yeah, Laura, for sure. Thank you so much for being here the whole time. I think I saw you the whole time. I'm the bread of life. Absolutely, Eli. Good stuff, man. It is, Melanie. It's all connected. It is unreal. Yeah, good call, good catch on the. It's so funny. You guys both said grace when I said, "What do you think of when I say 5?" You guys both grace. I was like, yeah, that's good. Good thinking. It just shows you the difference on how like minds think. Like I could say a number. I'm like, what do you think of when I say 3? I stayed awake. Well, good job, KB. When might you be on next? I don't know. Yeah, Picky for sure. Good to see you again. I don't know. What is today? Today's Saturday. Saturday, Sunday. I don't know. Probably Monday or Tuesday, but I'm not sure. But yeah, we're early release scheme. It's Trinity. There you go. 5 is my favorite number. Okay. So you are already prepped, primed, and ready to go. But yeah, probably Monday or Tuesday, if you are interested. This class. I don't even know if I would view it as a class. I don't view it that way. I just looking at it like we're just talking about the Bible and learning stuff and giving you a way to think. It's not the perfect way to think, but it's a way to think. And I think about a lot of the things that I say, and I'm just like So it's things are always bouncing around in there, and especially when I like read something and I look at it again, like I keep going back to what we already talked about, and I'm like, what is going on here? So it's interesting. What about a fivefold ministry? What about a fivefold ministry? Here's a bugs. I'm always interested. Yes. Eye-opening. Yeah. Hello. Hey, thanks, Sandy. Good to see you. Oh, awesome, Melanie. That is super cool. Hello. Hey, Josh. Still here, man. That's awesome. Good to see you again. Absolutely, Melissa. Get you an apple for your car dash. Hey, thanks, man. I appreciate it, Josh. Wheat and tares, he says to let them grow together till the last days. Isn't that crazy? And then there's going to be a separation. There's so much, it really, Matthew, something. Hey, thank you, child of God, thank you for that gift. When we do when we're going through Matthew, like the misconception is that Matthew is an easy book because everybody in the world knows about the book of Matthew, right? Like we all know Matthew. Oh, it's one of the Gospels. It's got to be easy. No, not easy. Just because you know about the existence of the book of Matthew doesn't mean that it's easy. Very difficult, and I'm learning that. Absolutely, Cindy, for sure. My husband mentioned that verse yesterday. Weird. Which one? About the wheat and tares? Picky? Meaty chapter. That's a word. That's a way to word it. Absolutely. Yeah, something like that, Josh. Yeah, I like being loud and energetic, and so if I was screaming, they all have noisemakers though, so I don't know if it would wake them up or not. But yeah, I like screaming. Screaming! Getting loud. Okay. All right. Yes, wheat and tares. Okay, yeah, very cool. We're closing in on, you want to talk about a meaty chapter. We're narrowing in to Matthew 24, man. It's gonna be an adventure. I'm looking forward to it. It's gonna be fun. But yeah, no, everything going on. So kind of changing topics real fast, just because we didn't talk about it at the beginning, but just with Israel in mind, there's so much going on. There was I forget who the U.S. Official was who made the statement, but basically said that Israel is expanding its war on Hezbollah, and they used the word war. And I saw that on Amir Sarfati's page, and so I thought that was very interesting. And so it's heating up over there, just because things we're all kind of like waiting for like this big thing to take place. Like big things are taking place every single day over there, and so we need to remember that. There's literally like 80,000 people who moved out of their homes in the north part of Israel. They left the north part of Israel to get out of there because of the rockets going back and forth between Hezbollah or between Lebanon and Israel. And so they moved to get away from the danger zone. And so, Israel has a huge decision to make. They're like, hey, this is not sustainable for our economy. If all of these people are out of their houses and they're not at work and they're not doing this, like, how are we going to continue on as a country with this constant threat into the north? And so Israel is like, what are we going to do? And so now it seems like they are focusing, because Gaza seems to be kind of less of an issue for them now because of everything that's happened over there. But they are going to be addressing the threat in the north right now. And so if they start taking on Hezbollah, then Iran doesn't want to lose Hezbollah. And so that might mean that Iran's going to get personally involved. And it's just, it just could spark and trigger this domino effect. And it's just unreal to see this kind of stuff. Ezekiel, I don't think so. Lisa, blocked. No, Ezekiel, no. No. I was thinking actually first and second Peter, possibly. That's what I was kind of thinking. Yeah. So that's what I was kind of thinking. Thoughts on the next book? Man, you guys are looking for the next book. We just now made it halfway through Matthew, and you guys just stop rushing me like this. My mind hurts. I woke up today, and I'm just letting you guys know, I'm just being transparent with you guys. I was not a happy camper today. I felt like unmotivated. I'm like, just one of those days. But we're okay now. I feel better. But no, it's just interesting. It is tough. Sometimes you feel it, sometimes you don't. But I do think probably Peter. I'm about to wake up my son. Might use instruments today. I'll have a bit of noise. The battle is real. Yes, it is. The Peters are smack upside the head. Awesome. Peter, see, Jules says Revelation. Who's ready to dive back into Revelation? I knew. Yeah, I just think Peter, I think we'll do Peter. You need a power nap. Oh, man, I had one of those once. Please rest as needed. Oh, yeah, I definitely do. I try, and sometimes, some rest as usual, like with everybody. Some rest is better than other rest, and sometimes it's not good rest. Sometimes it's okay rest, but it is what it is. I am thankful to be a part of this whole Bible study. Honestly, like I think it's really built me up in many different ways, and I'm able to be a my body is getting weaker, but I am getting stronger spiritually, and I'd rather it be that way than the other way around. It's interesting. I see these videos on TikTok, and there's this one guy who's basically like screaming at you to get inside the gym and like yelling at you, and it's like he does a good job at like motivating people who want to like get back into the gym and stuff like that, or keep going. It's like, oh, I'm sore, I'll go tomorrow. It's like, you're sore? You get in there right now. And he just starts screaming at the top of his lungs trying to motivate people and stuff. And it's just funny because like that is what people want so badly. And it's so fascinating because I was talking to my buddy the other day about working out, and we were talking about this guy named Ronnie Coleman. I don't know if you guys know who that is, but Ronnie Coleman is like this huge name in bodybuilding. He was this huge just monster. He could like, oh my goodness, he was just a beast. But if you see him today, he like, I'm pretty sure he uses like a walker to walk, and he's still like, it's because his body's completely destroyed. And so you see his body deteriorating and stuff like that. And I'm just like, man, his whole life was the gym, and he still goes to the gym, and like, that's what he knows. And I'm like, it's always interesting looking at somebody else and using their life as an example. Because it's easier to do that, because it's like you can always ask a question about somebody else's life, because as long as the spotlight isn't on me, then it's okay. But using him as an example, it's just like, man, his whole life was working out and influencing people to work out, and what to eat, what not to eat, how to work out, how to proper form this and all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I don't know where he's at with the Lord, but I'm just like, is that really what you want to be known for? Or would you rather, when I look at my life, because like, putting me under the hot seat or under the spotlight, it's like, what have I done, with the majority of my life? The majority of my life, like, I've always tried to witness to people. That is one thing that I've tried to do, but like the majority of my life, like I was not like in the word, like I went to church, like I knew a lot of things. But there's a difference between knowing a lot of things and holding the hand and walking alongside of the person who those things about. Because I can know a lot of things about the Bible and be 15,000 miles away from him and be so disconnected. But there's a difference when I know those things about Jesus and I'm walking right next to him. And so there's that difference. And so your walk really, really does matter. And so like knowing things doesn't mean anything. Really, it's if you're acting on those things. And so that's what's really challenging. And we're all at different stages, and we're all different walks with Christ. And so just trying to build people up, meet them where they're at, try to love on them, and try to just show them Christ, and instead of like condemning them and hating on them and being like, what, I can't, like when we tell people the gospel, when we give the gospel to people, it's what we're doing. Like we are sowing. That's all we can do. But if like it's on God to do the rest of it from there. Like, I mean, that seed that is planted, we're just watering it. And so we're just trying to water it, some plant, some water, but God gets the increase. It's a supernatural thing. It is a supernatural thing that takes place. And there's like lives being changed every day. And it's really important to remember, because I'm guilty of this all the time. I'm just like, come on, Lord, like I'm so ready to go home. I want it so badly. I want the rapture to occur, just like everybody else. But from God's point of view, he's like, I want the person who is over here. I want that person that's over there. These people, I want these people, all these people, because he's not willing that any should perish. And it's really cool. So I'm just glad he waited for me. And while I'm thankful that he waited for me, I'm still here for a reason. And while I'm here, I'm going to tell people about Jesus the best that I can. And I do that as I go about my day to day. And that's what you need to be doing too. If you go to the grocery store and you just happen to spark a conversation with a random person and you see an opening, try to take it. If you go to the bank and you're just sitting there talking and you just like spark up a conversation with the teller or somebody who's in line with you, that's your mission field. If you're on the golf course and you're out there hitting a golf ball and you just start talking to somebody and he's like, Whatever, that's your mission field. If you're at work and you just have this conversation, that is your mission field. Wherever your feet are, that is where your field is. Your thoughts on the immigrant takeovers, sanctioned cities? Not surprising, but sad. Oh gosh, sad on the innocent. Yeah, that's absolutely tragic. you know, um, I don't know. I think it's absolutely ridiculous what's happening to our world right now. I am just blown away. Um, I think the whole system needs to fall, and I think we're watching the pieces being set in place for the system to fall. Because what is that there is going to be, if we understand that there's going to be a one world system, then we understand that the current system needs to collapse. And so what we're seeing is the collapse. For example, gold, currently just hit a new all-time high. So gold is going up and up and up and up. Just like 2 or 3 years ago, it was like $2,000 for an ounce of gold, and now it's at like 2,600 or something like that. I don't remember off the top of my head, but you're seeing BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, all coming together to bring in other nations, and there's already other nations that have been brought back into their original 5. And you're seeing this new system. You're seeing a new system being set in place. Is that the new system? I don't know. You're seeing technology. You're seeing it. So the whole immigration thing. Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely tragic. I mean, it's on purpose. They're allowing it to happen. And if America falls, then so does the rest of the world. And so it's just crazy. Oh man, I don't know. Who knows what the future holds? But you know what? On that note, I'm not supposed to be worrying on that. Because I can't change it. Like the powers that be, like they're the ones who are making all of these decisions. So me, I can just influence my immediate world. That's my responsibility. So my immediate world, and that's where it goes back to being a light as long as you possibly can while you're here, and trying to do that for the people that look to you and I. What? Did you? No, I didn't watch the debate, Lisa. Hope your cats and dogs are all safe and well. Yeah, no, that's in my neck of the woods, in Ohio, not too far from me. The elite hierarchy have hordes and hordes of gold bars and won't save them. It will not save them. Hide your pets, hide your wives, hide your kids. Our pets' heads are falling off. Golf, Henry. Oh man, I would love to go golfing with you out there. Kingdom Builder. Yes, it can. You're not ready for that conversation, I see. What conversation? Where in the Bible does it say to worship God? We need idols or images. I am so confused by that statement. Where in the Bible does it say to worship God we need idols or images? I'm Ron Burgundy. It's a couple hours away from me, thinking of going to check it out. Are you really? We'll swing on by. We can hang out. There's a good series on Vice channel called While the Rest of Us Die. It's very interesting. Oh no. Oh man. Come to Irish Open in the Royal Portrush. We always get free tickets. Oh, weird flex. I love lamp. Yeah. That's right, Miss Page. Oh man. Very dubious. All right, guys. Well, that's what I got for you guys. I just, it's like a bug in here. That is what I got for you guys tonight. Hopefully that was good for you guys. I enjoyed it. It's very, kind of cool to try to connect some dots. Hopefully was able to do that. Hopefully I will see you guys on Monday. Still doing horrible car TikToks. SD Benson, keep coming back, man. You know what? That is too funny that you keep coming back here. Every time you come back, You're always talking trash. And yet you just keep coming back, like, I don't know why. Like, you just like, you know what, I'm gonna say some crap to this dude who I don't even know while I'm sitting in my house, just whatever I'm doing, like, might as well make somebody else feel like trash. Thanks, buddy. You're helping me out. I really appreciate the love. I can feel it. It makes a lot of sense. I might as well just go and, try to make everybody feel like absolute garbage. Absolutely. I am absolutely kidding. You are more entertaining. I am more entertaining than you. I agree. That was very entertaining. Um, okay. Yes. So, all right. Sleep well, Americans. Yeah. All right, guys. I'm going to get out of here. Thank you guys so much for being here. Like I said, all of these studies are up on YouTube. There's a YouTube link up here if you want to do, if you're looking for a verse by verse Bible study. This is a good one. We just go through it verse by verse. We read every single word. We talk about every single verse, and we try to dissect it and try to get the better understanding of what's going on and try to paint a picture so that we can at least, it's in bite-sized pieces, or at least word it in a way that we can understand, which is challenging because reading the Bible alone, you miss a lot. Like if you're just reading it, and that's why I say there's a difference between reading and studying. And so it's really edifying to study the Word of God. So that is what we try to do here. So there's that YouTube that's up there if you're interested. It's fine if you're not, and just a tool for you. Yep, that's it right here. ITZ_sheesh. That's it. If you wanted to type that in YouTube, you will see that there. And all of our studies are up there. And it's a good one. I think it's a good one. But all right, guys, that is what I got for you guys. Hopefully I will see you guys on Monday. Yeah, absolutely, Sandy. And hopefully I will see you on Monday or Tuesday, maybe. I'll let you guys know. And try to tell somebody about Jesus until then. That would be really cool. I really think that would be, I'm telling you guys, like, if you tell somebody about Jesus, you are going to be energized. You're going to be so pumped up. You're going to get wind in your sails, and it's going to be very, very, very encouraging for you. Off to rowing. Have a good one, Henry. Thank you so much. Keep praying for Israel. Keep praying for the peace of Jerusalem, and keep lifting up those people that are in here that need prayer. Deidre is a big one right now. Keep praying for her. Leah, Jules, Christine, and I know there's some other ones here that need some prayer. Vino's another one, and yeah. So lift those people up, and the other ones that I missed that I'm sure I can't think of right now. But pray for these people. Pray for them all. Laura and as well. But yeah, lift those people up. Thank you guys so much for being here, and I will hopefully see you guys on Monday or Tuesday, Lord willing. All right, guys, be safe.